My son spoke very softly, saying his parents were an embarrassment, and suggested we leave his wedding through the back door to avoid causing trouble. I did exactly as he asked without arguing. 15 months later, when he saw me walk onto the stage of a national television broadcast, the panic in his eyes was absolute. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Garrison Wright and I am 70 years old. I stood in the gilded hallway of the Waldorf Astoria adjusting the frayed collar of my rented tuxedo. My wife Josephine stood quietly beside me in a simple, modest dress we had purchased on clearance months ago. The grand ballroom doors were closed, but the muffled sounds of a live string quartet and the clinking of expensive crystal bled through the heavy mahogany wood. Our son Jared was inside, celebrating his wedding to Victoria Harrington. Or rather, he was hosting an elite networking event completely disguised as a wedding ceremony. Jared suddenly slipped out of the ballroom and approached us with hurried, anxious steps. He did not smile. He grabbed my arm and pulled Josephine and me behind a massive marble pillar entirely out of sight from the roaming photographers and wealthy guests. He looked at my worn jacket and Josephine's unadorned neck with deep disdain. He stated clearly that our presence was disrupting the aesthetic of the evening. He claimed Victoria's family had invited key venture capitalists, powerful people who held the financial keys to his new tech startup. He called our working-class appearance a direct threat to his funding. He actually used the word embarrassment to describe his own mother and father. He looked at the woman who gave him life and the man who broke his back to feed him, and he asked us to leave through the kitchen service exit so his new investors would not see us mingling near the open bar. He explained that Victoria's parents had carefully curated the guest list to project an image of generational wealth, and we simply did not fit the narrative he was trying to sell. He pointed at the kitchen swinging doors, instructing us to exit quietly so the valet staff would not associate us with his new family. He promised he would call us next week, but right now his future depended on our immediate absence. I looked down at my shoes. They were steel-toed boots polished to a high shine because I could not afford proper dress shoes after paying for our travel expenses. I stared at the scuff marks hidden beneath the thick layer of black wax. Those heavy boots had carried me through 30 years of grueling construction work. I vividly recalled the biting cold of February mornings pulling triple shifts in the freezing rain to earn overtime pay. I mixed concrete and hauled massive steel beams until my hands cracked and bled just to pay the exorbitant tuition for the private academy that placed Jared in the exact same room as these wealthy elites. I built the very foundation he now stood upon to look down at me. Josephine had worked double shifts at a local diner, coming home smelling of grease and cheap coffee, saving every crumpled dollar bill in a glass jar so Jared could attend elite summer coding camps. We sacrificed our youth, our comfort, and our physical health to ensure he would never have to struggle the way we did. We never took a vacation, we never bought new cars. We poured every ounce of our existence into his success. Now he stood before us in a tailored Italian suit flanked by marble columns and gold fixtures, treating us like dirt stuck to the bottom of his designer shoes. I felt a massive surge of anger rise in my chest. It was a hot, sharp betrayal that demanded to be voiced. I wanted to grab him by his expensive lapels and remind him exactly who paid for his arrogant confidence. I wanted to expose his fake elite persona to the entire ballroom, but I swallowed the anger. I knew that arguing with a fool only proves there are two fools in the room. I kept my mouth shut. I looked at the cold, calculating expression on my son's face and realized the boy I raised was entirely gone. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene or demand the respect I had rightfully earned over a lifetime of sacrifice. I simply reached out and gently squeezed Josephine's hand. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting a profound, quiet sorrow, but she understood my silent decision. She always understood. I turned my attention back to Jared. I gave him a single definitive nod. We turned our backs on our only son. Josephine and I walked down the narrow, dimly lit service hallway, passing startled waiters and busboys carrying silver trays of caviar and champagne. We pushed open the heavy metal doors at the back of the luxury hotel and stepped out into the damp, freezing alleyway, walking directly past the overflowing dumpsters. We left his perfect, curated world behind without shedding a single tear. The cold pavement of the alleyway chilled me to the bone as the heavy metal door slammed shut behind us. I pulled my coat tightly around Josephine's shoulders to shield her from the biting wind. We walked toward the street corner to hail a taxi. Just as I raised my hand, my phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. It was a high-priority security alert from my private banking portal. I pulled the device out and stared at the glowing screen in the dark alley. The notification was clear and entirely devastating. A $500,000 equity loan had just been forcibly extracted. The collateral used for this massive sum was the deed to our family home. The home Josephine and I had paid off decades ago with our blood and sweat. Someone had bypassed our security protocols and leveraged everything we owned. The timeline matched perfectly with the extravagant wedding expenses and Jared's desperate need for startup capital. The emotional sting of the wedding rejection vanished, immediately replaced by a cold, calculated realization. My son had not just pushed us out of his life. He had stolen our future to finance his own. The arrogance of his request at the wedding suddenly made perfect sense. He did not just want to hide us from his new wealthy in-laws. He needed us gone before we could uncover the devastating financial crime he had committed against his own flesh and blood. The silent exit through the back door was over. A new relentless war had just begun. The cab ride back from the Waldorf Astoria was engulfed in a suffocating silence. Josephine stared out the passenger window at the passing streetlights, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing screen of my phone, the glaring notification of the $500,000 equity loan burning into my vision. The cold dampness of the alleyway still clung to our rented formal wear, but an entirely different kind of chill was settling deep inside my chest. When the taxi finally pulled up to our worn red brick house, I did not bother taking off my coat. I walked straight past our small kitchen and headed directly into my home office. The space was intentionally simple, filled with dented filing cabinets and a scarred oak desk. It perfectly masked the immense financial infrastructure I secretly controlled from this very room. I booted up my encrypted computer terminal. I bypassed the standard consumer banking portals and logged directly into the master ledger of my private wealth management network. It took me less than 3 minutes to locate the exact transaction. My hands gripped the edge of the heavy desk as the digital PDF loaded onto the screen. It was a formal equity extraction agreement leveraged entirely against the deed of the house Josephine and I had paid off decades ago. I scrolled to the final page to examine the authorization. There, resting boldly on the bottom line, was my name, Garrison Wright. The ink was digital, but the stroke pattern was unmistakable. The loop of the letter G was jagged, rushed, and tilted sharply to the left. I did not need a handwriting expert to tell me who executed this document. It was the exact same erratic scrawl I had seen on birthday cards, college applications, and every desperate loan request my son had ever made. Jared had not merely stolen from me. He had committed a brazen act of federal identity theft. He used my name to gut the financial foundation of the home he grew up in. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. He actually believed I was just a tired, old, retired construction foreman who would never notice the digital movement of massive funds until the bank sent a foreclosure notice in the mail. He assumed my financial literacy ended at balancing a paper checkbook. He was banking on my absolute ignorance to fund his elite charade. Josephine walked into the office carrying 2 steaming mugs of black tea. She set one down next to my keyboard and stood closely behind my chair. Her dark eyes scanned the glowing document on the monitor. She did not gasp or express shock. My wife possessed a quiet, terrifying strength that had anchored our family through decades of relentless hardship. She leaned closer to the screen and focused intently on the forged signature. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped her lips. She pointed a steady finger at the jagged loop of the letter G. She calmly reminded me of the time Jared was in the 7th grade. He had failed his midterm geometry exam and tried to hide the terrible grade from us. Instead of studying harder or asking for tutoring, he chose the easy way out. He had taken one of her old grocery lists, traced her signature against the window pane, and forged her name on the bottom of his report card. Josephine had caught him instantly because he always rushed the first letter, failing to mimic her elegant cursive. Back then, we sat him down at the kitchen table and lectured him sternly about the severe consequences of deceit. We punished him firmly, hoping the lesson would take root in his character and guide him toward becoming an honorable man. We honestly believed we had corrected a foolish childhood mistake. Now, looking at the glaring evidence on the screen, we realized the horrifying truth. That childhood habit had not been eradicated. It had simply evolved with his ambition. Jared had taken a petty middle school deception and escalated it into a massive federal financial crime. Josephine picked up her mug, her expression hardening into absolute resolve. She stated flatly that our son had finally crossed a boundary that parental love could no longer excuse or repair. We had spent our entire adult lives shielding him from the harsh realities of the world, absorbing the brutal pain of poverty so he could eventually walk into rooms lined with gold. Our fierce protection had not made him a better man. It had turned him into a reckless, entitled parasite who viewed his parents as disposable resources. I did not waste another second dwelling on the heartbreak. The time for paternal grief had officially passed. I picked up my phone and dialed the secure, unlisted line of Simon Pierce. Simon was not a standard family attorney. He was a financial predator, a brilliant and ruthless wealth manager who oversaw the vast hidden resources of my private equity firm. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and alert despite the late hour. I did not offer any pleasantries or explain my emotional state. I gave him a direct, unequivocal order. I instructed Simon to initiate a total immediate freeze on every single asset, credit line, and bank account connected to Jared. I demanded a comprehensive forensic audit of my son's entire financial existence to be completed within 48 hours. I wanted to know exactly where every dollar went, every hidden debt he owed, and every corporate lie he had documented. Simon asked no probing questions about my son. He simply confirmed the objective, repeated the parameters of the asset freeze, and hung up the phone. The trap was officially set in motion. I sat back in my chair, transitioning my mind from a betrayed father to a calculating executive ready to dismantle an enemy. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated loudly against the oak desk, shattering the quiet of the office. It was Simon calling back far sooner than anticipated. I answered immediately. His voice was sharp, completely lacking its usual measured professional calm. He informed me that his initial trace of the $500,000 loan had yielded a highly disturbing result. The stolen money had not been transferred into the operating accounts of Jared's failing tech startup, as I had initially assumed. Instead, the entire sum had been instantly wired offshore and routed directly into a luxury real estate holding company. Simon read the name of the corporation aloud. It was the exact holding company owned and operated by the family of Victoria Harrington, my new daughter-in-law. Jared had deliberately mortgaged his parents' home to secretly pay off his wealthy wife's hidden family debts. He had sacrificed our security to buy his way into their fraudulent empire. Before I could fully process the sheer sickening magnitude of this ultimate betrayal, a violent, aggressive pounding echoed through the hallway. Someone was hammering their fists relentlessly against our front door, demanding immediate entry. The heavy thudding against the solid oak door vibrated through the floorboards of the hallway. I stepped out of my home office, meeting Josephine in the narrow corridor. Her face remained a mask of perfect, impenetrable composure. We had spent 4 decades building a life of quiet dignity inside these brick walls, and we were not about to let anyone shatter our peace. I reached the entryway, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the front door open. Standing on my porch beneath the flickering amber light were Victoria's parents. The man wore a sharply tailored navy suit that looked completely out of place in our modest working-class neighborhood. His wife stood slightly behind him, wrapped tightly in a thick cashmere coat. She clutched a designer handbag against her chest as if she expected to be robbed the moment she stepped foot on our property. Her eyes darted around the porch with blatant disgust. They did not wait for an invitation to speak. Victoria's father immediately thrust a thick legal folder toward my chest. He carried a smug, deeply condescending smile that instantly reminded me of the predatory real estate developers I used to crush during my early days in commercial acquisitions. He announced that his family holding company had officially acquired the primary mortgage and deed to this property. He spoke in a loud, slow cadence, treating me as if I lacked the cognitive capacity to understand basic English terminology. He explicitly stated that Jared had willingly signed over the collateral rights to fund Victoria's new lifestyle expectations. Our son had traded our lifelong financial security to ensure his new wife could maintain her elite social standing among her peers. The man tapped the heavy folder with his manicured index finger. He demanded that Josephine and I vacate the premises within exactly 30 days. He claimed the property was slated for immediate redevelopment, and our continued presence was a legal liability to his corporate portfolio. He wanted us out of the home we had owned and maintained for 40 years. He stood on the steps I had poured with my own hands, completely oblivious to the reality of the man he was actually threatening. Victoria's father did not stop at simply delivering an eviction notice. He clearly wanted to twist the knife, cementing his perceived superiority over my family. He puffed out his chest and offered what he called a charitable solution. He stated that his company had connections with a low-income assisted living facility on the heavily polluted industrial side of the city. He promised to cover our first month of rent out of his own pocket. He was positioning himself as a benevolent savior to the poor, uneducated parents of his newly acquired son-in-law. Josephine stood beside me in total silence, her posture radiating an absolute chilling grace. She did not react to the insult. We operate as a single unit, and she knew I was already analyzing the battlefield. I did not focus on the man's arrogant words. I focused entirely on his physical reality. During my long decades building commercial infrastructure and acquiring massive tracts of land, I learned to read men by the microscopic details they tried desperately to hide. I looked past the expensive navy suit and the heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist. I noticed the deep, jagged scuff marks on the heels of his Italian leather loafers. A man with true generational wealth maintains his footwear flawlessly, paying meticulous attention to his foundation. A man drowning in unmanageable debt stops paying the cobbler because his credit cards are maxed out. I observed the slight, uncontrollable tremor in his left hand as he held the legal folder out to me. I recognized the rigid, hyper-defensive posture of a corporate executive staring directly down the barrel of total, inescapable bankruptcy. Real power stands completely still. Fake power projects loud volume and aggressive hostility to mask a rotting hollow core. Victoria's family was entirely broke. They were not acquiring my home to expand a thriving, successful real estate portfolio. They were cannibalizing Jared's stolen equity to keep their own sinking ship afloat for another month. The man standing on my porch attempting to humiliate me was not a conquering king. He was a desperate, cornered animal trying to extract the last drops of blood from a manufactured alliance with my foolish son. I reached out and firmly grasped the legal folder from his trembling hand. I did not flinch, raise my voice, or offer the emotional outburst he was clearly anticipating. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing a broken father. I looked directly into his eyes, watching the arrogant smirk falter just a fraction under my unwavering, dead-eyed gaze. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm. I thanked him for taking the time to personally deliver the documentation to my doorstep. I told him the night air was far too cold for a man of his advanced age to be standing around on a working-class porch. Before he could utter another patronizing syllable or process the absolute lack of fear in my response, I stepped back. I smoothly closed the heavy front door directly in his face. The solid click of the lock echoed with finality. I heard his muffled, indignant scoff through the wood before his expensive, scuffed dress shoes clicked rapidly down the concrete walkway toward his idling luxury sedan. The heavy engine of his car roared to life and faded down the dark street, leaving the house in complete silence. Josephine locked the secondary deadbolt and turned to look at the thick folder in my hands. We did not exchange a single word of worry. I walked back into the illuminated glow of my home office and laid the documents flat across my scarred oak desk. I bypassed the fraudulent signature at the bottom of the page and focused entirely on examining the corporate header of the transfer agreement. I needed to verify the exact financial chain of custody involved in this theft. The primary creditor listed directly above Victoria's family holding company caught my immediate attention. The paperwork clearly showed that the Harrington Family Trust did not actually own the debt they were attempting to collect. Their entire portfolio was heavily leveraged through a massive international private equity firm called Apex Holdings. I stared at the bold black letters printed across the top of the official eviction notice. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face as the absolute brilliance of the situation settled in. I am the founding partner and the silent absolute chairman of Apex Holdings. Victoria's father had just handed a brutal eviction notice to the man who actively owned every single dollar his failing family owed. They had blindly walked into a steel trap and I held the key. I left the red brick house long before dawn the next morning. I left Josephine sleeping peacefully, knowing she trusted me to handle the threat that had arrived on our doorstep. I drove my old, unassuming pickup truck deep into the financial district, bypassing the gleaming, ostentatious lobbies of the corporate towers. I swiped my keycard and entered through a highly secured subterranean garage reserved strictly for executive partners. Simon Pierce's office occupied the entire top floor of an impenetrable glass and steel fortress. The space was completely devoid of personal warmth. It featured polished concrete floors, minimalist leather chairs and soundproof walls designed strictly for the execution of high-level financial warfare. Simon stood waiting for me, his expression grave and tightly controlled. He did not offer a handshake or a sympathetic greeting. He merely pointed to the massive conference table occupying the center of the room. Hundreds of printed financial statements, ledger transfers, and corporate portfolios covered the pristine glass surface. The true terrifying scope of my son's betrayal was laid bare in harsh black ink. Jared and Victoria's family, the Harringtons, were completely bankrupt. They possessed zero liquid assets and held no actual equity in any of their heavily marketed ventures. Their entire existence was a carefully constructed mirage funded by crushing, unmanageable debt. Victoria's father had leveraged everything he owned to maintain his membership in the elite circles of the city. He had maxed out every corporate line of credit, drained the Harrington family trust down to its last dollar, and taken out massive predatory loans just to keep his luxury vehicles in his driveway and his country club memberships active. Jared had mortgaged his own parents' home not to launch a groundbreaking technology startup, but to plug a massive bleeding hole in his father-in-law's sinking ship. My son had purchased his seat at their dinner table using the roof over my head as the entry fee. And the most beautiful, devastating irony of it all was that every single one of those predatory loans traced back to a series of holding companies. Those companies were all wholly owned subsidiaries of Apex Holdings. They were living entirely on my money. Simon tapped a specific stack of bound documents near the center of the table. He reminded me of the aggressive commercial property acquisitions we had orchestrated together in the late 1980s. Back then, I was working grueling night shifts managing a structural steel crew. I poured concrete in the blistering heat and welded steel frames in freezing rain until my joints ached and my hands were covered in thick calluses. I took every single dollar of overtime pay, lived far below my means, and quietly bought up abandoned derelict commercial lots in the neglected, highly undesirable districts of the city. The wealthy elites, including the Harrington family, laughed at those investments. They called the land worthless dirt. 2 decades later, the city expanded exactly as I had predicted. Those empty lots became the most prime commercial real estate in the financial sector. Simon pointed to a specific property deed displaying a familiar corporate logo. The Harrington family's massive glass-fronted corporate headquarters was built directly on one of my original lots. Victoria's arrogant father did not even own the ground beneath his own mahogany desk. He held a 99-year lease, a lease that was currently controlled absolutely by Apex Holdings. Every time Victoria bragged about her generational wealth and old money status, she was standing on soil I had purchased with blistered hands and sore muscles. I had spent 40 years building an empire in the shadows because I believed true wealth required absolute silence. I wanted Jared to inherit a kingdom, but I wanted him to earn the right to rule it first. I wanted him to understand the weight of a dollar before he was given millions. Instead of learning the value of hard work, he had allowed himself to be blinded by the superficial shine of the Harrington family. He had chosen the illusion of power over the reality of it, trading his integrity for a seat at a table of bankrupt frauds. I looked at the vast sea of paper spread across the glass table. I did not feel a single drop of sorrow for my son. I felt the cold, precise clarity of a veteran architect preparing to demolish a condemned building. I instructed Simon to move immediately. He was to utilize our anonymous shell companies to quietly purchase every single outstanding debt associated with Jared and the entire Harrington family. I wanted every mortgage, every business loan, every maxed-out platinum credit card transferred directly into my personal control by the end of the business day. I told Simon to build a financial cage around them so tight they would not be able to buy a cup of coffee without my direct authorization. I wanted to own the very air they breathed. Simon nodded, his fingers flying across his encrypted keyboard as he executed the massive acquisitions. He locked down their financial lifelines with the ruthless efficiency I paid him for. We were transforming their reckless spending into a loaded weapon aimed directly at their fake empire. Just as Simon finalized the last debt transfer, cementing our total control over their lives, his secondary computer monitor flashed with a new high-priority alert. Our elite cybersecurity team had successfully intercepted the internal communications from Jared's startup servers. Simon opened a recently flagged email thread and read the contents aloud. The blood in my veins instantly turned to ice. Jared was not stopping at the fraudulent eviction. He had secured the services of a highly corrupt, off-the-books physician. The email outlined a detailed, deeply sinister plan to bring this doctor to the red brick house under the guise of a routine wellness check for an elderly parent. The doctor was being paid a massive sum of stolen money to officially declare me legally incompetent due to severe cognitive decline. Jared intended to strip me of my bodily autonomy, lock me away in a state-run psychiatric ward against my will, and seize total control of my remaining physical assets. My son was not just trying to steal my house, he was coming to destroy my mind. I returned from Simon & Pierce's downtown office and parked my worn pickup truck in the narrow driveway of our red brick house. The sky was beginning to cast long gray shadows across the front lawn. Josephine was waiting in the kitchen. I informed her of the intercepted email and the impending arrival of our son. We simply sat in the living room and waited in total silence. Less than an hour later, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed on the wooden porch, followed by a sharp knock on the door. I stood up and pulled the door open. Jared stood on the welcome mat. He was not alone. Beside him stood a man wearing a pristine white medical coat, clutching a black leather satchel. Jared did not look angry. Instead, he wore a deeply unsettling expression of manufactured grief. He stepped into the house uninvited, gesturing for the man in the white coat to follow him into our living room. Jared introduced the stranger as Dr. Eris, a highly respected private neurologist. My son adopted a soft, patronizing tone, the kind of voice one might use to soothe a frightened toddler. He looked at Josephine and me with fake, watery eyes. He claimed he had been tracking my behavior for months and was deeply concerned about my sudden, rapid cognitive decline. He pointed to the confrontation at the wedding and my refusal to accept the eviction notice as clear evidence that I had lost my grip on reality. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a thick stack of legal documents. He placed them gently on the coffee table. He stated these papers were a full medical and financial proxy. Jared insisted that I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs. He demanded I surrender all legal control of my life, my finances, and my medical decisions to him immediately for my own protection. Dr. Eris stood quietly in the background, a silent, complicit prop, ready to validate my mental incompetence. I remained perfectly still in my armchair. I did not raise my voice, and I did not defend my sanity. I simply watched my son execute his pathetic, theatrical display of false compassion. As Jared rambled on about memory care facilities and specialized nursing homes, my mind drifted away from the immediate threat. I remembered sitting at this exact same coffee table 25 years ago. A 10-year-old Jared sat across from me, his eyes locked on a wooden chessboard resting between us. I spent countless evenings after my construction shifts trying to teach him the mechanics of the game. I wanted to instill a sense of patience, discipline, and strategic foresight into his developing mind. I explicitly taught him that a truly masterful player never announces his strategy. A grandmaster builds his trap in absolute silence, allowing the opponent to believe they are winning right up until the final, inescapable move. But Jared always lacked patience. He was impulsive, driven entirely by the desire for quick, unearned victories. Whenever he thought he had the upper hand, he would push his pieces forward with reckless aggression, completely abandoning his defenses to secure a fast win. I would calmly capture his unprotected queen and remind him of the golden rule. A weak player always reveals his trap too early because a weak player is blinded by his own arrogance. Looking at the 35-year-old man standing in my living room, I realized he had learned absolutely nothing from those childhood games. He assumed I was a helpless, uneducated old man who would instantly crumble under the imposing presence of a white coat and a stack of legal jargon. He brought a fraudulent doctor into my home because he believed I lacked the resources and the intellect to defend myself. He was revealing his entire endgame before he had even secured the board. I looked closely at the slight bead of sweat forming on Jared's temple. He was attempting to project absolute authority, but beneath the expensive suit and the rehearsed dialogue, he was a terrified, drowning man desperately grasping for a lifeline to save his bankrupt in-laws. Dr. Eris cleared his throat, stepped forward and opened a leather-bound notebook. He adopted a slow, highly condescending tone and began asking a series of standard cognitive assessment questions. He asked me to state the current year, the exact date, the name of the sitting president, and my full home address. He then asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I answered every single question with cold, flawless precision. I did not hesitate or miss a single beat. I maintained unbroken, predatory eye contact with the fake physician the entire time, watching his forced confidence slowly evaporate. When he finished his humiliating questionnaire, I reached into the inner breast pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a sealed, heavy envelope bearing an embossed watermark. I dropped it onto the coffee table, letting it land directly on top of Jared's fraudulent proxy documents. I calmly informed Dr. Aris that the envelope contained a comprehensive, certified neurological evaluation. I had completed the extensive exams at Johns Hopkins Medical Center exactly 48 hours prior. The certified results proved my cognitive functions were exceptionally sharp and entirely unimpaired. I locked eyes with the man in the white coat. I advised him that if he signed a single fraudulent document declaring me legally incompetent, my private legal team would ensure his medical license was permanently revoked. I promised him I would file federal fraud and conspiracy charges against him before sunset. The color instantly drained from the fake doctor's face. He stared at the prestigious Johns Hopkins seal, snapped his notebook shut, and backed rapidly toward the front door. He scrambled out of the house without saying another word, leaving my son entirely isolated in the center of the room. The sudden cowardly departure of his hired medical accomplice shattered Jared's fake sorrow completely. The mask of the deeply concerned son evaporated in a fraction of a second, replaced by raw, unhinged fury. His face flushed a deep shade of crimson as the reality of his failure set in. He snatched the useless proxy documents off the coffee table, crumpling the thick paper in his shaking fists. He realized his sophisticated medical trap had failed miserably, leaving him exposed, legally vulnerable, and completely out of options. He screamed that I was deliberately ruining his life. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of family loyalty or compassion. He declared that Victoria's family legally owned the deed to the property, and he no longer needed my signature or my compliance to force me out onto the street. Jared spat out a final, desperate threat, his voice echoing loudly off the living room walls. He promised he would contact his father-in-law and send a heavily armed private security team to physically drag Josephine and me out of the house by midnight. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the front door, slamming it so hard the glass panes rattled in their wooden frames. The quiet evening was gone, replaced by a ticking clock. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just chimed the half-hour past 11 when the violent pounding began. The heavy rhythmic thud of fists striking the solid oak of our front door reverberated through the quiet house, shaking the framed family photographs hanging on the corridor walls. I did not rush. I walked steadily down the hallway, feeling the familiar cold precision of a commanding executive settle completely over my mind. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door open to face the freezing night. Jared stood on the front porch, flanked by 4 massive men dressed in tactical black gear. They were highly paid private security contractors, their postures aggressive, their hands resting near their utility belts. It was an entirely unnecessary display of force for evicting 2 elderly citizens. But Jared had always loved theatrical intimidation. My son held 2 cheap canvas suitcases by their plastic handles. With a sneer of absolute unvarnished contempt, he hurled them past me. The bags tumbled clumsily down the concrete porch steps, landing with a dull thud on the damp, frost-covered grass of the front lawn. Jared stepped aggressively into the entryway, bringing the biting winter wind inside with him. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project a dominance he had never actually earned, and ordered us out of our own home. He proudly announced that the Harrington Family Trust had officially executed the deed transfer less than an hour ago. According to his twisted, fabricated reality, the red brick house no longer belonged to Garrison and Josephine Wright. He claimed we were officially trespassing on private corporate property. He loudly instructed the security team that they were fully authorized to physically remove us from the premises by force if we did not vacate immediately. He actually smiled as he delivered the ultimate threat, relishing the manufactured power he believed he held over the man who had given him everything. He looked around the modest entryway, his eyes filled with disgust for the home that had sheltered him for 18 years. I turned away from his arrogant face and looked toward the end of the hallway. Josephine stood there completely unfazed by the 4 imposing mercenaries crowding our threshold. She was already wearing her heavy wool winter coat, the dark buttons fastened perfectly up to her neck. She did not shed a single tear, nor did her hands tremble as she calmly pulled her black leather gloves over her slender fingers. I watched her serene, impenetrable expression and felt a profound wave of respect for the woman I had married 45 years ago. We had built our life from absolute nothingness, fighting for every single inch of ground we possessed. I remembered the harsh early days of our marriage, living in a cramped, drafty apartment with a leaking roof in the industrial district. We had pooled our meager wages from double shifts just to keep the radiator running during the bitter winter months. We had weathered crushing poverty, physical exhaustion, and the cruel prejudices of the world with unbroken, fierce solidarity. We purchased this red brick house with the very first real money I earned from my grueling independent contracting jobs. We laid the oak hardwood floors ourselves, painted every single wall, and turned a neglected, broken structure into an unassailable fortress of warmth and love. Jared stood in the center of that fortress right now, foolishly believing he was stripping us of our greatest lifetime achievement. Josephine walked slowly toward the open door, her chin held high, moving with the regal grace of a queen surveying a ruined landscape. She stopped beside me, her dark eyes locking onto our son with chilling, absolute clarity. She did not yell or express the profound, agonizing heartbreak of a betrayed mother. She simply reached out, adjusted the collar of my coat, and spoke in a steady, melodic voice that echoed clearly in the freezing air. She told me that a house is only made of dead brick cut wood and fragile glass, but a man's true dignity is his ultimate and eternal shelter. She stated with absolute conviction that no thief could ever steal our foundation, because our foundation was built on honor and honest blood, something Jared would never possess or understand. Jared scoffed loudly at her words, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling as if her profound wisdom was nothing more than the pathetic rambling of a senile old woman. I felt no urge to physically fight the armed guards or raise my voice in a futile, desperate argument over forged property deeds. I already knew the grand end game. I had already constructed a flawless financial guillotine around his entire existence. I offered my son a final, silent glance, committing the pathetic image of his arrogant, stolen victory to memory. I stepped down off the porch and walked purposefully onto the damp, freezing lawn. I bent down and picked up the 2 cheap suitcases he had thrown into the dirt. I offered Josephine my arm, and we walked down the driveway together with perfect, unbowed posture. A sleek, armored black town car was already idling quietly at the curb, arranged hours ago by Simon Pierce. The professional driver quickly opened the rear door for us. I helped my wife into the heated, luxurious leather interior. I looked back at the house one last time. Jared was standing dead center in our empty living room, his hands resting on his hips, smiling victoriously as his security team secured the perimeter of the property. I closed the heavy car door, completely sealing out the freezing wind and the sight of the mercenaries. I tapped the glass partition and the driver pulled smoothly away from the curb. I kept my eyes locked on our old home through the heavily tinted rear window. Just as our vehicle reached the end of the block, the trap violently snapped shut. The warm yellow lights inside the red brick house instantly extinguished, plunging the entire property into absolute suffocating darkness. The street lamps outside remained brightly illuminated, isolating the total blackout perfectly. My encrypted phone buzzed on the leather seat next to me. It was a secure message from Simon Pierce confirming the flawless execution of my final directive for the night. Apex Holdings had officially pulled the municipal levers. The city water mains, the electrical power grid, and the gas lines connected exclusively to that specific address had been completely and permanently severed. Furthermore, the property had just been flagged for immediate demolition by the Municipal Zoning Board, backed by an expedited commercial redevelopment permit I had secured that very afternoon. Through the dark window, I could see the faint, frantic glow of Jared's smartphone illuminating his panicked face in the pitch-black living room. He was completely trapped in a freezing, powerless shell that was officially scheduled to be bulldozed into dust. The town car glided seamlessly away from the frozen, powerless brick house and merged onto the deserted expressway leading directly into the heart of the city. Josephine relaxed into the heated leather seat, gazing out at the blur of passing streetlights. We did not speak of the cold lawn or the cheap suitcases left behind in the frost. We had played the role of the humble, discarded parents to absolute perfection. Our driver bypassed the quiet residential neighborhoods and steered us toward the towering glass spires of the financial district. He pulled into the subterranean garage of the city's most exclusive residential high-rise. An armed concierge greeted us by name and escorted us to a private biometric elevator. We ascended 50 floors in utter silence. The doors opened directly into our actual residence. It was a sprawling $20 million penthouse wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic, unobstructed view of the glittering metropolitan skyline. I had purchased this property under a blind trust over a decade ago. We used it exclusively when conducting high-level corporate warfare, keeping our quiet suburban life completely separate from the cutthroat reality of Apex Holdings. Josephine hung her wool coat in the mahogany vestibule and walked toward the expansive kitchen to pour us a glass of vintage scotch. I walked straight into my primary command center. The room was dominated by a massive curved glass desk and banks of encrypted monitors. I had given Jared enough rope to hang himself with the fraudulent proxy and the illegal eviction. Now it was time to systematically dismantle the core of his arrogance. I booted up the secure terminal and bypassed Simon Pierce, entirely pinging the chief director of Apex Holdings' Corporate Intelligence Division. I ordered a zero-footprint deep dive extraction on every single digital asset connected to my son's tech startup. I wanted to see the architecture of the company Jared claimed would revolutionize the industry. I wanted to look inside the engine that fueled his massive ego. Within 20 minutes, my monitors flooded with intercepted proprietary data, internal company emails, and thousands of lines of raw source code. I sat back in my leather chair and began to read. As my eyes scanned the intricate lines of programming cascading down the main screen, a deep, bitter realization settled over me. I recognized the unique architecture of the software immediately. 5 years ago, Apex Holdings had aggressively acquired a highly innovative but financially mismanaged data compression firm based out of Seattle. The founder was a brilliant engineer who lacked fundamental business acumen, driving his own creation straight into bankruptcy. I absorbed his defunct company, locked the revolutionary source code inside the Apex proprietary vault, and quietly waited for the market to mature before deploying it. My son had spent 2 years working as a junior project manager within one of my subsidiary data firms. It was a job I secured for him anonymously to teach him the mechanics of the tech industry from the ground up. Instead of learning the trade, Jared had utilized his temporary security clearance to access the archived files. He had meticulously copied the Seattle engineer's lifework onto an untraceable external drive. The groundbreaking algorithm Jared had been parading around elite venture capital circles was completely stolen. He had merely slapped a sleek, modern user interface over the stolen engine, rebranded the product under his own corporate banner, and built an entire fraudulent empire on the back of blatant intellectual theft. He stood in the Waldorf Astoria in his tailored Italian suit, looking down at my scuffed steel-toed boots while building his entire elite persona using property he had secretly pilfered directly from my vault. My son possessed no original genius. He was a spectacular empty vessel sustained entirely by the creative labor of far superior men. He had leveraged his stolen confidence to woo Victoria Harrington, dazzle her bankrupt parents, and secure his position in high society. Every single ounce of his perceived worth was a lie built on stolen code and forged signatures. The sheer magnitude of his parasitic nature disgusted me. I poured the scotch Josephine handed me down my throat, feeling the sharp burn mirror the cold fury radiating in my chest. He had stolen my home to pay for his wife's debts, and he had stolen my property to pay for his pride. I did not call Jared to confront him with this devastating discovery. I reached across the glass desk and engaged a direct line to my lead intellectual property litigator. I forwarded the extracted source code along with the original ironclad copyright patents held by Apex Holdings. I instructed my legal team to file a massive airtight patent infringement lawsuit against Jared's startup before sunrise. I demanded an immediate emergency federal injunction to instantly freeze the distribution, sale, or licensing of his flagship software. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in around him with no warning. The injunction was crafted to be invisible until he attempted to conduct any business transaction, at which point the digital trap would snap shut on his wrists. The legal maneuver was executed with brutal, silent efficiency. By the time the markets opened the following morning, every single line of code inside Jared's corporate servers was locked under a federal mandate. He could not sell a single software license. He could not pitch the technology to private buyers. He could not even legally access his own developer dashboard without risking severe federal prison time. His entire company was instantly transformed into a paralyzed, worthless shell. The federal injunction hit Jared's corporate inbox like a devastating tectonic shift. Through my intercepted digital feeds, I watched his frantic, panicked emails fly across his internal network as he realized his software was completely locked down. His startup was hemorrhaging capital and his wealthy in-laws were secretly bankrupt. With his primary product legally frozen and his private funding rapidly drying up, my son was pushed into a corner of absolute desperation. He could no longer rely on quiet backdoor networking deals at country clubs or luxury weddings. He needed a massive immediate injection of untraceable cash to fight the injunction and keep his fraudulent empire afloat. My intelligence division flagged a high-priority outgoing application from Jared's personal computer later that evening. In a move of sheer, reckless arrogance, my son had leveraged his remaining social connections to secure an emergency spot on a highly popular live, nationally televised venture capital broadcast. He intended to pitch his stolen technology to a panel of billionaire investors in front of a live studio audience to secure immediate salvation. He was walking straight into the brightest spotlight in the country. The sun rose over the financial district, casting long, sharp reflections against the floor-to-ceiling glass of my penthouse. I had successfully paralyzed Jared's stolen startup, locking his fraudulent technology behind an impenetrable federal injunction. My son was currently suffocating in his own blind panic, frantically trying to salvage his stolen crown. But my work was not yet finished. I shifted my focus away from the foolish thief and turned my absolute attention toward the enablers of his supreme arrogance. Victoria's family had orchestrated the hostile takeover of my red brick home with gleeful malice. They believed they were untouchable aristocrats operating high above the consequences of their actions. It was time to show them exactly who owned the ground they walked on. I initiated a secure video conference with Simon Pierce. He was already waiting in his downtown office, reviewing the vast, damning portfolio of consolidated Harrington debt we had quietly absorbed overnight. I gave him the signal to execute the commercial eviction. Victoria's father operated his entire luxury real estate enterprise out of a massive glass-fronted headquarters located right in the prime commercial sector. What he never advertised to his wealthy social circle was that he did not actually own the land beneath his flagship building. He held a strict 99-year commercial lease. Apex Holdings owned that dirt. I instructed Simon to formally terminate that lease. The legal justification was airtight and brutal. Victoria's father had secretly leveraged the building's operational funds to cover his personal catastrophic debts, triggering a direct and fatal breach of his lease covenants. Simon deployed a team of elite corporate litigators and federal marshals directly to the Harrington headquarters. They did not knock politely. They marched straight past the marble reception desk, bypassed the frantic security personnel, and walked directly into the executive boardroom. They handed Victoria's father a certified immediate notice of lease termination. He was ordered to vacate his corporate fortress and surrender the premises to the primary landholder within 48 hours. His empire was officially being seized in broad daylight. As Simon narrated the successful delivery of the eviction notice through our encrypted video feed, I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and pictured the look of utter shock on the man's face. My mind instantly carried me back to the gilded hallway of the Waldorf Astoria on the night of the wedding. I remembered standing quietly beside Josephine in our modest, rented formal wear, waiting to be ushered out the service exit like common criminals. Before Jared had pulled us behind the marble pillar to hide us away, I had locked eyes with Victoria's father across the grand ballroom. He was holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne surrounded by fawning investors and local politicians. When his gaze landed on my scuffed steel-toed boots, his face contorted into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. He looked at me not as a fellow father or a respectable human being, but as a dirty stain on his pristine, carefully curated canvas. He judged my entire worth by the frayed fabric of my collar. I have spent my entire life building massive structures from the cold ground up, pouring deep concrete foundations and welding iron skeletons that can easily withstand Category 5 hurricanes. I know exactly what solid, enduring architecture looks like. I also know what a fragile, hollow facade looks like. Victoria's father was a man built entirely on fragile vanity. He existed solely for the applause of his wealthy peers. His expensive tailored suits, his leased luxury vehicles, and his massive corporate headquarters were nothing more than theatrical props designed to desperately hide a rotting, bankrupt core. Men constructed from vanity crumble the absolute fastest when their audience is forcefully taken away. Take away their grand stage, and they instantly forget how to breathe. I had chosen to live a quiet, unassuming life precisely because I understood that invisible wealth grants true, unassailable power. The Harrington family had chosen loud, desperate visibility. They had mortgaged their dignity to buy cheap applause. Now the heavy velvet curtain was dropping violently on their stage play, and they were utterly unprepared for the crushing silence that would follow. The immediate termination of his corporate lease sent a massive shockwave of sheer panic through Victoria's father. His initial reaction was entirely predictable. He defaulted to the aggressive bullying tactics he had used to intimidate weaker men for decades. He scoffed loudly at the federal marshals, crumpled the eviction notice in his fist, and grabbed his desk phone to summon his expensive team of corporate defense attorneys. He fully intended to fight the eviction by burying Apex Holdings under a mountain of frivolous litigation, utilizing his vast liquid assets to tie the property up in court for years. He dialed his primary private banker, screaming frantic demands to authorize a massive transfer of emergency retainer funds. Instead of the usual subservient compliance he demanded, he was met with a cold, robotic apology from the bank manager. Every single one of his personal corporate and offshore accounts was completely frozen. He demanded a furious explanation. The banker calmly informed him that an external entity had recently purchased and consolidated all of his outstanding debts, triggering an automatic, irreversible asset lock due to severe default status. Apex Holdings had not just taken his land. I had built an impenetrable financial cage around his entire life. He could not access a single dollar. He could not hire a defense lawyer. He could not even pay for the luxury car waiting for him in the executive garage downstairs. His theatrical power vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, suffocating reality of total insolvency. Stripped of his money, his lawyers, and his corporate throne, Victoria's father spiraled into absolute, unadulterated desperation. The false aristocrat was entirely cornered. He frantically uncrumpled the eviction notice and furiously scrolled through the legal headers of the debt consolidation paperwork, desperately searching for any possible lifeline. He found the registered corporate contact information for Apex Holdings. Below the standard legal routing numbers, there was a single highly restricted emergency contact line meant only for extreme executive escalations directly to the chairman of the board. He did not know my name. He did not know my face. He only knew that the unseen titan at the top of this corporate pyramid was the only entity on Earth capable of stopping his total annihilation. He snatched his cell phone with trembling, sweaty fingers and dialed the restricted sequence of numbers. He prayed for mercy from a faceless billionaire. Miles away, high above the financial district, the silence of my penthouse study was suddenly broken. The private secure telephone resting on my polished mahogany desk began to ring. The secure telephone resting on my polished mahogany desk shattered the silence of the penthouse study. It rang with a sharp, urgent cadence, a desperate sound demanding immediate salvation. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the sheer terror on the other end of the line to marinate and multiply. I reached across the pristine glass surface and picked up the heavy receiver. Before uttering a single syllable, I pressed a specific silver button on my communication console. The device instantly activated a sophisticated cryptographic voice modifier, shifting my natural baritone into a mechanized, resonant, and entirely unrecognizable timbre. I offered a cold, calculated, single-word greeting. The voice that responded was breathless, frantic, and completely stripped of all its former aristocratic arrogance. Victoria's father was hyperventilating into the receiver. He begged for mercy from the unseen titan of Apex Holdings. He pleaded for a temporary extension on the commercial eviction and the massive debt consolidation that had just paralyzed his entire existence. He babbled uncontrollably, promising massive returns, offering exorbitant interest rates, and swearing blind loyalty to a chairman he had never even met. I remained completely silent, letting the vacuum of the encrypted line amplify his rising panic. Recognizing that his empty promises were failing to secure a lifeline, the desperate man quickly pivoted to his final pathetic bargaining chip. He claimed he had a foolproof guarantor. He proudly offered up his wealthy, brilliant son-in-law, Jared. Victoria's father frantically explained that Jared was the CEO of a groundbreaking technology startup. He swore that the company was on the absolute verge of securing massive national venture capital funding. He insisted that Jared was scheduled to appear on a live, nationally televised broadcast the very next evening, where he would undoubtedly secure millions in liquid assets. He detailed Jared's supposed genius, citing the very software that I knew was pilfered from my own archives. He promised that the television investors would throw endless capital at the project, capital that would be immediately diverted to clear the Harrington family's debts. He spoke rapidly, his voice cracking with fear, utterly oblivious to the profound irony of his proposal. The frantic patriarch was actively attempting to leverage my own son's stolen company to save his sinking corporate ship. He was completely unaware that the man holding the executioner's axe was the exact same man he had sneered at in the Waldorf Astoria hallway. I listened to the sweating man willingly offer his own son-in-law up as sacrificial collateral. A deep, cold satisfaction settled in my chest, replacing any lingering trace of paternal sorrow. This single phone call validated everything I had ever believed about the fragile transactional nature of the elite class. There is absolutely no genuine loyalty among parasites. They construct their entire lives around a carefully curated illusion of generational wealth and unbreakable family bonds. They host lavish country club dinners, toast each other with expensive champagne, and pretend their alliances are built on mutual respect and shared legacy. But beneath the tailored suits and the forced smiles, they are nothing more than starving leeches attached to a dying host. I remembered the stories Jared used to tell me about the Harrington family's incredible loyalty and their supposedly untouchable moral high ground. He had abandoned the values of hard work, discipline, and honest labor because he was seduced by their glittering superficial warmth. He actually believed Victoria's father respected him as a man and as an equal. He believed he was an integral partner in their grand historic dynasty. But the brutal truth was playing out through the encrypted speaker on my desk. The pristine image Jared worshipped was a total fabrication. He had discarded genuine parental devotion for conditional approval, an approval that vanished the instant the bank accounts were frozen. The very second the invisible host disappeared, the second my money was forcefully removed from their ecosystem, the parasites immediately turned their fangs on each other. Victoria's father does not hesitate for a fraction of a second to throw Jared directly into the line of fire. He was perfectly willing to let his daughter's husband be completely consumed by apex creditors if it meant he could keep his mahogany desk for one more week. It proved that Jared had traded his integrity, his parents' home, and his own moral compass for a seat at a table filled with cowards. He had mortgaged his entire future to buy into a family that would gladly sell him for spare parts at the first sign of financial distress. The Harrington dynasty was a hollow, rotting carcass, and I was watching it devour itself from the inside out with absolute clarity. I interrupted his pathetic rambling with a single sharp command. The mechanized voice modulator projected absolute authority across the line, slicing through his hysteria. I informed Victoria's father that Apex Holdings would grant him a strictly temporary 72-hour extension on the commercial eviction. He began to weep with relief, praising my generosity, but I quickly severed his gratitude with my one non-negotiable condition. Through our previous intelligence sweep, I knew Victoria's father held a substantial 30% equity stake in Jared's startup. It was a stake he had ruthlessly demanded when Jared foolishly mortgaged my red brick house to plug the Harrington family's bleeding debts. I demanded that he sign over every single one of those equity shares directly to Apex Holdings immediately. If he hesitated for even a moment, the federal marshals would clear his building by dawn and liquidate his personal assets. He did not ask a single question. He did not attempt to warn Jared negotiate the percentage or protect his daughter's financial future. He agreed instantly, his voice shaking with cowardice. I signaled Simon Pierce, and the digital transfer contracts were sent directly to the man's inbox. I listened to the frantic clicking of his keyboard over the phone. He signed away his son-in-law's company in less than 3 minutes, finalizing the absolute surrender of his loyalty. Across the city, Jared sat in his darkened, powerless living room, staring blindly at his glowing smartphone screen. The federal injunction had already paralyzed his software, but the final devastating blow arrived via an automated legal notification. The digital alert bluntly informed him that his father-in-law had just executed an emergency total transfer of his 30% equity stake. Jared read the receiving corporate entity and felt the blood freeze in his veins. The shares had been surrendered directly to Apex Holdings, the exact same invisible conglomerate that currently held the federal injunction against his stolen code and orchestrated his eviction. The brutal reality of his total isolation crashed down upon him. His powerful father-in-law had completely sold him out to save himself. Jared was entirely alone, surrounded by corporate predators he could not see. He realized with terrifying clarity that his impending appearance on the live, nationally televised venture capital broadcast was no longer just an opportunity for business expansion. It was a matter of absolute survival. If he failed to win over the billionaire investors tomorrow night and secure immediate capital to fight the injunction, he would not just face public bankruptcy. The impending default would trigger an immediate federal investigation, sending him straight to a maximum security prison. The neon lights of the television network's VIP dressing corridor flickered with a sterile, unforgiving hum. Inside Green Room B, the carefully constructed illusion of Jared and Victoria's elite marriage was violently tearing itself apart. I watched the live, high-definition security feed from a monitor on my penthouse desk, utilizing the backdoor network access Simon Pierce had secured hours earlier. My son paced the length of the small, claustrophobic room like a trapped animal. His expensive designer tie hung loose around his neck, and his usually immaculate hair was a disheveled mess. He screamed at his wife, his voice cracking under the immense, crushing pressure of his impending federal prosecution. He aggressively waved his smartphone in her face, displaying the automated legal notification confirming her father's complete surrender of the startup's equity. He cursed the entire Harrington family for their sickening cowardice. He explicitly reminded her that he had committed fraud and mortgaged his own parents out of their home solely to plug the massive bleeding holes in her father's sinking real estate empire. In return, her father had served him up to Apex Holdings on a silver platter the exact second his own survival was threatened. Victoria did not shrink away from his fury. She matched his venom with a vicious, aristocratic rage of her own. She sat rigidly on the cheap leather sofa, her face pale and contorted with pure spite. She screamed that her entire social life was ruined because of his sheer incompetence. She viciously detailed how her platinum credit cards had been declined at a luxury boutique that afternoon, humiliating her in front of her high society peers. She blamed Jared for failing to secure the venture capital funding months ago, demanding to know how he managed to let a federal injunction freeze his entire software distribution network. Neither of them possessed the capacity for accountability. They were two starving parasites locked in a confined space, furiously devouring each other now that the host had been eradicated. Jared paced back to the vanity mirror, gripping the edges of the table until his knuckles turned white. He stared at his own terrified reflection, hyperventilating heavily. He declared that tonight's live broadcast was his absolute last chance. If he did not secure a massive immediate injection of cash from the panel of television investors tonight, his company would officially default and he would be spending the next decade in a federal penitentiary. I turned away from the glowing monitor and walked into the expansive master dressing room of my penthouse. The time for distant observation had permanently ended. It was time to step out of the shadows and physically enter the battlefield. I completely bypassed the modest, unassuming garments I usually wore to navigate the city unnoticed. I reached into the back of the cedar-lined closet and selected a bespoke charcoal gray Italian suit. It was cut from the finest heavy wool, tailored with absolute uncompromising precision by craftsmen who understood the architecture of power. I slipped into the crisp white shirt and fastened the heavy platinum cufflinks Josephine had gifted me on the day Apex Holdings cleared its first $1 billion in liquid capital. I had spent 40 years deliberately hiding my vast wealth behind scuffed steel-toed boots and faded flannel work shirts. I wanted to move through the world invisible, allowing my arrogant enemies to wildly underestimate me based on the frayed edge of a collar. I had worn my cheapest, most worn-out suit to Jared's luxury wedding specifically to test his fundamental character. I wanted to see if he valued the man who raised him over the superficial, glittering shine of the elite class. He had failed that test spectacularly. He had looked at me with the exact same unfiltered disgust as Victoria's bankrupt father. Tonight, I would grant them their ultimate wish. I would present them with the ruthless, unassailable corporate titan they so desperately worshipped. Josephine walked into the dressing room, her footsteps completely silent against the thick carpet. She was already dressed in a tailored black evening gown, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, elegant clasp. She stepped gracefully in front of me and reached up to adjust my dark silk tie. Her hands were perfectly steady. She smoothed the sharp lapels of my jacket and looked directly into my eyes. She did not speak of sorrow or the tragic loss of the boy we had raised. The mourning period had ended the moment he brought a fraudulent doctor into our living room to strip me of my bodily autonomy. She told me that excising a cancerous rot from the body is always a bloody, agonizing process, but leaving it to fester guarantees a slow death. She stated with absolute chilling clarity that true justice requires a remarkably steady hand and a completely cold heart. I nodded, absorbing her iron strength. We were entirely aligned. We were walking into the television studio not to teach our son a lesson, but to execute a definitive public demolition. The armored town car glided seamlessly through the rain-slicked streets of the financial district, pulling smoothly into the private subterranean loading dock of the television broadcasting center. I did not enter through the chaotic front lobby filled with aspiring entrepreneurs, interns, and eager audience members. Simon Pierce had already arranged a totally frictionless infiltration of the facility. A senior network executive was sweating visibly as he waited for my heavy vehicle to come to a halt in the concrete bay. He rushed forward to open my door, bowing his head with intense, nervous reverence. I completely ignored his frantic, desperate attempts at small talk. He led Josephine and me past the armed security checkpoints, completely bypassing the metal detectors and registry logs required for standard guests. We walked through a dimly lit labyrinth of heavy black cables and concrete corridors moving directly beneath the main studio floor. The network executives treated me with the utmost terrified respect. They understood perfectly well that the chairman of Apex Holdings possessed enough liquid capital to buy their entire broadcasting network and dissolve it before morning. I was ushered into a soundproof VIP viewing gallery positioned directly above the main stage, hidden completely behind a wall of one-way glass. I looked down at the bright studio lights, waiting for the execution to begin. Down in the chaotic dressing corridor, a sharp, authoritative knock shattered the screaming match inside Green Room B. Jared abruptly ceased his pacing, instantly smoothing his wrinkled tie and forcing a deeply unnatural, confident smile onto his face. The heavy wooden door swung open, and the lead stage manager stepped into the room holding a glowing digital clipboard. He looked highly uncomfortable, refusing to make direct eye contact with my son. He informed Jared that there had been an immediate, unprecedented change to the broadcasting format for his specific pitch. The stage manager bluntly stated that the regular panel of 5 billionaire investors had been completely removed from the stage. Jared's face went entirely pale. He demanded to know who was going to fund his company if the investors were gone. The stage manager swallowed hard and explained that the production company had just received a massive, undeniable financial buyout for this exact segment. A mysterious, anonymous super investor had purchased the exclusive right to evaluate Jared's startup personally. Jared was instructed to walk out onto the brightly lit stage completely alone. He felt a massive surge of desperate adrenaline, foolishly believing an eccentric billionaire was about to hand him his salvation, entirely unaware he was walking straight into a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving the sterile fluorescent glare of Green Room B feeling smaller and more suffocating than a concrete prison cell. The stage manager's revelation that a single anonymous super investor had completely bought out the television segment hit Jared like a physical blow to the chest. He began to pace frantically across the cheap industrial carpet. The manufactured confidence he had desperately tried to maintain shattered into a million jagged pieces. He was sweating profusely, dark, humiliating patches forming rapidly under the arms of his tailored Italian suit. The ticking clock on the wall echoed loudly in his ears, measuring the final seconds of his fading corporate empire. A young, terrified makeup artist stepped forward with a powdered sponge, attempting to blot the heavy sheen of pure panic coating his forehead. Jared violently swatted the woman's hand away. He screamed at her to get out of his sight, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, hysterical edge. He then turned his unhinged, spiraling fury onto his 2 remaining startup staff members, viciously berating them for failing to uncover the identity of the mysterious billionaire who had hijacked their broadcast. He hurled a plastic water bottle across the room, watching it shatter violently against the vanity mirror. Victoria remained seated on the faux leather sofa, utterly unmoved by his violent outburst. She slowly crossed her legs and filed her perfectly manicured nails. She did not offer him a single word of comfort or solidarity. Instead, she delivered a cold, venomous ultimatum. She explicitly reminded him that her father's bank accounts were entirely frozen. Her platinum credit cards had been declined at a luxury boutique that afternoon, and their elite social standing was entirely in ruins. She stared directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes and stated with absolute terrifying clarity that she was not built to endure poverty. If he failed to walk out onto that stage and secure the emergency millions required to save her lifestyle, she would divorce him before the morning news aired. She promised to leave him with absolutely nothing, ensuring he faced his impending federal fraud charges entirely alone. Her ruthless threat hung heavily in the stagnant air, leaving Jared completely isolated in his desperation. His skeleton crew scrambled out of the room in fear, leaving him to face the crushing weight of his impending performance. He forced himself to take deep, jagged breaths, staring at his pale, sweating reflection in the cracked vanity mirror. He vigorously smoothed down his expensive silk tie and began to frantically rehearse his opening pitch. He muttered the carefully crafted lines under his breath, desperately trying to summon the charismatic visionary persona he had used to con his way into the upper echelons of society. He recited his heavily fabricated narrative of humble beginnings. He spoke passionately of pulling himself up from absolute nothingness by his own bootstraps. He practiced a dramatic, calculated pause, intended to convey the sheer magnitude of his entirely fictional struggle to the television audience. He crafted a compelling story of a young, misunderstood genius who built a revolutionary technology company through sheer willpower and relentless grinding innovation. It was a sickening, beautifully packaged lie. As he repeated the hollow words to the mirror, he actively, consciously erased every single ounce of sacrifice his parents had made. He conveniently omitted the grueling double shifts I had worked in freezing rain and blistering heat to put food on his plate. He scrubbed away the memory of his mother sitting up until midnight mending his clothes so he could look presentable and confident at school. He entirely deleted the undeniable fact that I had mortgaged my own home, the red brick house I had paid for with blistered hands, just to finance his entry into Victoria's elite circles. He viewed his parents as nothing more than disposable stepping stones, mere peasants who lacked the intellectual capacity to understand his brilliant destiny. He had taken decades of our bleeding devotion and completely rewritten it into a solo triumph of his own making. He desperately believed his own myth. He had convinced himself that he was a self-made titan, completely ignoring the devastating fact that his revolutionary software was a stolen ghost and his foundational wealth was extracted directly from my veins. He adjusted his posture, practiced his winning, arrogant smile, and prepared to sell a stolen product to a billionaire. A sharp, rapid knock on the heavy wooden door shattered his intense rehearsal. A young production assistant poked her head into the room holding a glowing headset tight against her ear. She announced that the commercial break was over and the live broadcast was resuming in exactly 60 seconds. It was time for him to take the stage. Jared closed his eyes and took one final deep breath. He forcefully buried his rising panic, wrapping himself entirely in his manufactured armor of elite corporate arrogance. He did not look back at Victoria as he marched out of the green room. He strode down the dark, chaotic backstage corridors with aggressive, determined steps. The ambient noise of the frantic production crew faded into a dull roar as he approached the heavy black curtains separating him from the arena. He pasted his rehearsed predatory smile onto his face, completely ready to dazzle the mysterious savior waiting on the other side. He stepped boldly past the heavy velvet drape and walked directly into the blinding white glare of the national television stage. Jared hit his designated center mark on the highly polished studio floor. The bright, searing spotlights illuminated him perfectly, broadcasting his confident, expensive facade to millions of viewers across the country. The live studio audience fell into a hushed, anticipatory silence. The massive digital screens behind him pulsed brightly with his startup's stolen logo. A deep mechanical voice resonated through the studio speakers, announcing the unprecedented arrival of the anonymous super investor. At the far end of the stage, the towering electronic doors slowly slid apart, releasing a thick curtain of theatrical fog. A single solitary figure stepped out from the deep shadows and walked purposefully into the harsh light. The man did not wear the flamboyant, trendy attire of a Silicon Valley venture capitalist. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray Italian suit cut with brutal, uncompromising precision. Jared's rehearsed, arrogant smile instantly and completely froze. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stared directly into the cold, unyielding eyes of the man he had tried to forcefully commit to a psychiatric ward. I stepped fully onto his stage, ready to demolish his empire on live television. The blinding white glare of the studio spotlights washed over me like a physical wave of heat as I stepped out of the heavy, artificial fog. The live audience erupted into a synchronized, deafening applause, heavily prompted by the flashing digital signs suspended high above the sprawling soundstage. I did not wave to the crowd or acknowledge the frantic, manufactured cheering. I walked with the slow, measured stride of a veteran executioner ascending the wooden steps of a scaffold. My bespoke charcoal gray Italian suit absorbed the harsh studio lighting, casting a stark, imposing silhouette against the vibrant LED screens, displaying my son's stolen corporate logo. I bypassed the row of empty leather chairs positioned at the edge of the stage and moved directly to the oversized center seat, the designated throne specifically reserved for the anonymous super investor. I sat down, fastened a single button on my jacket, and projected an aura of absolute, unassailable authority. Directly across from me, standing completely paralyzed on the circular pitch mark, was Jared. The manufactured arrogance he had fiercely maintained while screaming in the green room had instantly and entirely evaporated. His jaw hung slightly open in a silent, pathetic gasp. His breathing was rapid and shallow, visibly straining against the stiff collar of his designer shirt. He gripped the small black presentation clicker so tightly that the skin over his knuckles stretched stark white. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped blindly off a sheer cliff and was suspended in the air, simply waiting for the inevitable impact. From my elevated vantage point, I could clearly see into the darkened wings of the side stage. Victoria was standing there, surrounded by bustling camera operators and audio technicians holding thick bundles of cables. She had been eagerly waiting in the shadows to watch her husband secure the millions required to salvage her fabricated elite lifestyle. Instead, the bright stage lights illuminated my face. The heavy exclusive designer purse slipped entirely through her perfectly manicured fingers. It hit the concrete floor with a dull, heavy thud that went entirely unnoticed by the cheering crowd but registered perfectly in her wide, horrified eyes. The physical manifestation of her shattered reality was exquisite to witness. Her father had surrendered their empire an hour ago, and the filthy blue-collar peasant she had banished from her wedding was sitting calmly on the throne of her salvation. I shifted my gaze back to the center of the stage, locking eyes directly with my son. The massive television cameras were rolling smoothly, gliding on their robotic tracks, transmitting this live feed to millions of screens across the nation. Yet in that specific fraction of a second, the vast crowded auditorium felt entirely empty. I looked straight past the expensive tailoring, the meticulously styled hair, and the desperate pleading panic radiating from his rigid posture. I did not see a visionary technology CEO on the verge of changing the world. I saw the exact same terrified little boy who used to break his own toys in fits of rage, hastily hiding the shattered pieces under his bed to avoid any accountability. He had spent his entire adult life building a massive, glittering wall of stolen confidence to completely mask his fundamental cowardice. He had drained my bank accounts to buy his way into Victoria's bankrupt family. He had stolen a dead man's proprietary source code to buy his way into the competitive tech industry. He had deliberately attempted to steal my very sanity and lock me in a psychiatric ward simply to bury the evidence of his crimes. I sat quietly under the glaring lights and searched the depths of my chest for a single lingering ounce of paternal pity. I found absolutely nothing. True love requires strict boundaries, and protecting a parasite only ensures the eventual agonizing death of the host. I had spent 40 grueling years laying bricks, pouring freezing concrete, and building an ironclad foundation meant to sustain him for a lifetime. He had chosen to dynamite that entire foundation for a fleeting, superficial round of applause from a room full of frauds. He genuinely believed that the harsh rules of consequence did not apply to him because he wore an expensive suit and possessed a charismatic smile. He was about to learn that gravity does not care about the price of your fabric. Millions of viewers were currently leaning forward in their living rooms, eager to watch a young, self-made genius secure his grand destiny. They had no idea they were about to witness a live, uncompromising corporate demolition. The silence on the stage stretched to an agonizing, deeply uncomfortable length, building the tension in the room to a breaking point. The polished television host stepped forward, sensing the heavy, unscripted dead air dragging down the broadcast. He offered the cameras a bright, professional smile and turned his attention to my son. He enthusiastically prompted Jared to begin his pitch, inviting him to share the incredible, inspiring story behind his revolutionary software. Jared swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his throat. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. A pathetic, ragged breath escaped his dry lips. He pressed the button on his clicker with a trembling thumb, attempting to desperately pivot the presentation to a generic slide displaying fabricated market projections. He needed to look anywhere but at my face. He stumbled violently over his rehearsed lines, mixing up his revenue models with his user acquisition statistics. His voice cracked and wavered, completely devoid of his usual magnetic, persuasive charm. The live audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, murmuring in widespread confusion at the spectacular, unmitigated meltdown happening live on stage. I did not let him suffer through the entire pathetic charade. I raised my right hand, executing a single sharp motion that instantly cut through the humid studio air. It was a silent, absolute command that completely paralyzed Jared and brought the entire multi-million-dollar production to a grinding, breathless halt. I slowly lowered my hand and turned my attention away from the sweating, stammering fraud standing on the center mark. I looked directly at the bewildered television host, my voice amplified clearly and powerfully through the crisp studio microphone carrying absolutely no trace of the digital modifier I had used during my phone call. I spoke with the cold, resonant timbre of a man who owned the very ground beneath their feet. I informed the host, the crew, and the millions watching at home that a financial pitch was entirely unnecessary tonight. I stated with crystal clarity that I had not come to this studio to evaluate an investment opportunity because I already owned the company standing before me. A collective audible gasp rippled through the dark audience. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew a thick, legally binding document bearing the pristine embossed seal of Apex Holdings. I held the papers up directly under the blinding spotlights for the cameras to capture. I announced that this was the finalized irrevocable transfer of 30% of the startup's total equity. I read the signature at the bottom of the page aloud, explicitly and publicly thanking Victoria's bankrupt father for his complete, unconditional surrender. Jared's eyes widened in sheer, unparalleled terror as the heavy jaws of the velvet guillotine finally snapped shut. The dead silence in the studio stretched into an agonizing eternity as Jared stared blankly at the embossed seal of Apex Holdings. I did not give him a single second to recover his shattered composure. I placed my thick black leather portfolio onto the glass table separating us and opened it with slow, deliberate precision. The television cameras instantly zoomed in closely on my hands, broadcasting every calculated movement to millions of viewers across the country. I withdrew the first stack of meticulously compiled financial reports and began the systematic, ruthless dissection of my son's entire corporate existence. My voice echoed through the massive auditorium, cold and unyielding, as I stripped away the glittering facade of his startup layer by layer. I addressed the audience directly, stating clearly that the company they were led to believe was a revolutionary tech marvel was in reality a bankrupt shell constructed entirely on a foundation of severe criminal fraud. I pulled a highly classified banking dossier from the folder and read the exact staggering figures of Jared's hidden liabilities. I detailed the massive amounts of undisclosed offshore debt he had accumulated at exorbitant interest rates simply to artificially inflate his company's public valuation. The studio audience gasped collectively as I read the precise dates and routing numbers of the forged loan documents Jared had used to secure his initial operating capital. I explicitly pointed out the forged signatures of his initial phantom investors, explaining how he had fabricated revenue streams out of thin air. I did not stop there. I reached deeper into the portfolio and extracted the proprietary software schematics. I held the technical blueprints up to the glaring studio lights and revealed the most damning truth of all. I explained that the groundbreaking algorithm Jared claimed to have developed from scratch was line for line a stolen ghost. It was proprietary source code pilfered directly from the highly secured archives of his former employer, a blatant act of corporate espionage that carried mandatory federal sentencing. I read the original copyright dates, contrasting them directly against his fraudulent patent applications. Every single word I spoke was a surgical strike, dismantling his carefully curated image of a visionary genius and exposing him as a desperate, reckless thief. Jared stood entirely paralyzed on his center mark, visibly shaking as the absolute totality of his financial and legal ruin was broadcast live to the entire nation. I let the crushing weight of the stolen source code settle over the utterly silent studio before shifting my gaze directly back to my son. I looked at the impeccably tailored Italian silk draped across his shoulders, taking in the full measure of his synthetic aristocracy. I turned my attention back to the primary camera and explained the fundamental, irreconcilable difference between a true builder and a parasitic thief. I told the millions of watching viewers that a true builder understands the brutal, unglamorous reality of pouring a deep, enduring concrete foundation. A builder gladly trades the pristine condition of his own hands for the absolute structural integrity of the house he constructs to shelter his family against the storms. A thief, however, only understands the desperate theft of the finished aesthetic. A thief foolishly believes that stealing a golden crown instantly makes him a king, oblivious to the fact that his stolen throne is resting on quicksand. I pointed directly at Jared's chest, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that resonated through the soundstage. I informed the national audience of the exact retail cost of the custom midnight blue suit Jared was currently wearing. I cited the $4,000 price tag with absolute chilling precision. I then extracted a final devastating bank statement from my leather folder. I explicitly traced the routing of the funds used to purchase that exact garment. The money had not come from venture capital profits or brilliant software sales. I revealed that the funds were siphoned directly from a fraudulent secondary mortgage he had secretly placed on my own red brick home. He had draped himself in staggering luxury using the stolen remnants of a retired man's lifelong pension. I explained how he had forged my signature to completely drain my retirement accounts, cannibalizing the very foundation I had built with 40 years of grueling physical labor just to purchase a temporary ticket into Victoria's bankrupt high society. He had traded his parents' secure shelter for the fragile applause of people who actively despised him. The studio audience murmured in absolute vocal disgust. The narrative of the humble self-made entrepreneur had been entirely obliterated, replaced by the ugly, undeniable reality of a man who would gladly leave his own parents destitute simply to maintain the illusion of his own wealth. The sheer weight of the public humiliation finally broke the terrified paralysis gripping my son. Jared snapped. The polished, charismatic CEO completely vanished, replaced by a cornered feral animal lashing out for survival. He grabbed the small microphone attached to his lapel and began to scream hysterically into the studio audio system. He wildly pointed a shaking finger at me, declaring to the audience that the documents in my hands were elaborate, malicious forgeries. He shouted that I was nothing more than a bitter, senile old man suffering from profound delusions, desperately trying to steal the credit for his immense self-made success. He begged the camera operators to cut the feed frantically, claiming that my entire presence was a highly illegal coordinated stunt designed to ruin him. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic screaming. I remained perfectly seated, allowing his total lack of emotional control to clearly broadcast his guilt. I simply tapped a small, encrypted remote control resting in the palm of my hand. Instantly, the massive digital screen suspended behind Jared shifted from his stolen corporate logo to a highly detailed certified forensic audit. The massive display projected 50 pages of undeniable federally verified banking records and IP tracking logs directly linking him to every single act of fraud I had just detailed. The immediate fallout of the projected audit was chaotic and entirely irreversible. At the very edge of the stage, the polished television host pressed his hand aggressively against his earpiece. His professional demeanor completely collapsed as the network's panic-stricken legal team began screaming instructions directly into his ear, frantically demanding an immediate cut to a commercial break. But it was already far too late to contain the catastrophic damage. The live broadcast had completed its lethal surgical work. In the shadows of the side stage, Victoria stared in sheer, unadulterated horror at her glowing smartphone. The financial sector had reacted to my revelations with breathtaking, brutal speed. The live, real-time stock tickers connected to her father's luxury real estate enterprise and every single corporate entity associated with the Harrington family were currently in total freefall. The market algorithms had instantly recognized the massive interconnected web of fraud and toxic debt I had just exposed to the nation. The Harrington dynasty's entire net worth was plummeting into catastrophic insolvency right before her eyes. Jared's desperate gamble to save their empire had instead triggered their immediate, absolute, and highly public financial annihilation. The television host moved abruptly, stepping directly between the camera lens and my seated figure. He raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, his perfectly manicured smile now twisting into a grotesque expression of sheer panic. He babbled rapidly into his lapel microphone, desperately attempting to throw the broadcast to a commercial break. The network lawyers were screaming in his earpiece, demanding an immediate blackout to mitigate their own massive corporate liability. I did not yield a single inch of the stage. I simply stood up, towering over the frantic presenter, and locked my gaze directly onto the primary broadcasting lens. My physical presence commanded the room, radiating an immovable gravitational force that instantly silenced the host's desperate interruptions. The floor director, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the unfolding disaster, failed to cut the live feed. The red recording light on the primary camera continued to burn brightly, broadcasting every single second of the confrontation to the entire nation. I turned away from the trembling host and walked slowly toward the center mark where my son was standing. Jared was entirely hyperventilating now, his chest heaving under the crushing weight of his bespoke jacket. His eyes darted wildly around the studio, searching for any possible escape route from the inescapable trap I had perfectly sprung. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him, invading his physical space with absolute, unyielding authority. I spoke with brutal, surgical clarity, ensuring the studio microphones captured every single syllable. I told him that he could scream about forgeries and senility until his voice gave out, but the digital forensic trail could not be bullied, intimidated, or erased. I explained that the banking executives who had enabled his massive fraudulent offshore loans were currently cooperating with federal investigators to save their own lucrative careers. I detailed how his entire corporate infrastructure was a fragile house of cards, built exclusively on stolen intelligence and catastrophic deceit. He had spent his entire adult life running from accountability, hiding behind the expensive skirts of a bankrupt aristocratic dynasty. I informed him that the running had officially ended right here on this stage. The velvet curtain had dropped, the applause had died, and the crushing silence of absolute ruin was all that remained. Jared staggered backward, physically recoiling from the sheer force of the truth. He opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse, another desperate lie, but I cut him off instantly. I forced him to look directly into my eyes, stripping away the blinding studio lights and transporting him straight back to the gilded hallway of the Waldorf Astoria. I reminded him of the precise moment he had grabbed my arm outside the grand ballroom. I recounted how he had forcefully pulled Josephine and me behind a cold marble pillar, treating his own parents like dirty, shameful secrets. He had frantically ushered us out the service exit, desperate to hide our worn working-class hands from the pristine vision of his wealthy new in-laws. He had looked at the frayed fabric of my modest rented tuxedo with unfiltered disgust, entirely convinced that my presence would somehow contaminate his manufactured elite persona. He had judged my entire worth by a price tag, completely blind to the billionaire standing in front of him. My voice dropped to a razor-sharp whisper, yet it resonated perfectly through the silent, captivated auditorium. I told him that true worth is never determined by the label sewn into a collar or the zip code of a purchased address. I explained that I had built structures capable of weathering absolute destruction precisely because I understood the fundamental value of pouring an honest, grueling foundation. He had chosen to build his life entirely on optics, prioritizing the shallow approval of parasites over the blood and sweat of the people who had given him life. I took a deliberate step closer, ensuring my final judgment landed with maximum devastating impact. I stated clearly that embarrassment is not wearing a rented suit to a celebration of love. Embarrassment is wearing a stolen crown on national television. Embarrassment is mortgaging your own soul to buy a temporary seat at a table filled with cowards. He had traded his integrity for a fragile, glittering facade, and now the entire world was watching that facade completely disintegrate into worthless dust. The camera zoomed in tight on his face, capturing the exact moment the realization of his profound, irreversible failure finally broke his spirit completely. I turned my back on his trembling figure and addressed the national audience one final time. Operating under my absolute authority as the new primary equity holder of the startup, I formally announced the immediate total liquidation of the entire corporate entity. I stated that every single asset, server, and stolen line of code would be seized, dismantled, and sold to fully compensate the victims of his massive financial fraud. I turned slightly, looking over my shoulder at the completely ruined man standing on the center mark. I officially stripped Jared of his chief executive officer title on live television, terminating his employment effective immediately. I did not wait for a response. I did not offer a final sentimental goodbye. I simply buttoned my suit jacket, turned on my heel, and walked away. I exited the stage with steady, uncompromising steps, descending into the dark production wing. I left Jared standing completely alone, isolated under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the studio spotlights, totally abandoned by the very world he had sacrificed his own family to conquer. The panicked network executives finally managed to execute the emergency blackout. The massive digital screens instantly went dark, and the live broadcast feed was violently cut, replaced by a jarring, silent commercial placeholder. The deafening roar of the studio audience immediately transformed into a chaotic, buzzing frenzy of shock and confusion. Jared remained frozen on the center mark, staring blankly at the empty space where I had just been standing. He was completely paralyzed, his mind utterly unable to process the absolute totality of his destruction. From the deep shadows of the stage-right production wing, two figures emerged into the fading studio lights. They were not network producers or panicked stage managers rushing to offer him assistance. They wore dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering emblazoned across their shoulders. The two federal agents marched directly onto the stage, completely bypassing the scattered, terrified camera operators. They flanked Jared on both sides, their expressions professionally cold and unyielding. The lead agent reached into his jacket pocket and produced a thick stack of folded documents officially presenting Jared with federal warrants for his immediate arrest. The sudden blackout of the studio monitors plunged the backstage area into absolute pandemonium. Producers shouted overlapping directives while security personnel scrambled to secure the exits. In the center of the madness, Victoria Harrington completely snapped. The polished veneer of her aristocratic upbringing evaporated in a single explosive instant. She lunged forward, her high heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor, and shoved Jared violently in the chest. He stumbled backward, his arms flailing as he collided with a heavy light stand. Victoria did not hold back. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice a harsh, shrill siren cutting through the surrounding chaos. She accused him of being a pathetic, worthless fraud who had systematically dismantled her entire life. She shrieked that he had promised her endless wealth and unassailable power, but instead delivered catastrophic ruin and public humiliation. Every word was a venomous dagger designed to sever any remaining tie between them. She reminded him that her family name was a pristine, untouchable legacy until his filthy, incompetent hands dragged it through the mud. She detailed how her father's empire was now mere collateral damage in his pathetic attempt to play billionaire. She swore she would spend the rest of her life ensuring he rotted in a federal cell. The two federal agents reached the edge of the confrontation, their badges flashing under the emergency work lights. They commanded Jared to place his hands behind his back. Victoria did not stand by her husband. She did not offer a word of defense or comfort. Instead, she physically shoved him again, propelling him directly toward the waiting officers. She frantically brushed her expensive dress as if his mere touch had contaminated her with a deadly virus. She loudly proclaimed to the agents and anyone else listening that she had absolutely no knowledge of his criminal enterprises. She declared that she was merely another victim of his elaborate, disgusting con. Jared stood frozen, his breath hitching in his throat as the cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. He looked at the woman he had sacrificed his own parents to marry, finding nothing but pure, unadulterated hatred staring back at him. The illusion of their elite partnership was dead, replaced by the brutal reality of a sinking ship where the rats were viciously cannibalizing each other to survive. Realizing that berating a handcuffed man would not restore her frozen bank accounts, Victoria immediately recalibrated her survival strategy. She spun around on her stiletto heels and frantically scanned the darkened production corridor. She spotted my tall, tailored silhouette moving steadily toward the private VIP elevators at the far end of the hall. Desperation overrode whatever shred of dignity she had left. She abandoned her husband to the federal authorities and sprinted down the concrete hallway, calling out my name with a newly manufactured pleading sweetness. She intercepted me just as the heavy metal doors of the elevator began to slide open. Victoria threw herself in front of me, her eyes brimming with forced theatrical tears. She clasped her hands together and launched into a desperate, rehearsed monologue. She attempted to rewrite their entire history right in front of my eyes. She claimed that she had always suspected Jared was a liar, but was trapped in an emotionally abusive cycle. She insisted that she had absolutely no idea he had stolen his startup's source code or mortgaged my family home to finance their lifestyle. She played the role of the tragic, naive heiress, perfectly painting Jared as a master manipulator who had hypnotized her innocent father into making catastrophic financial decisions. She begged me to separate her family's legacy from his criminal prosecution. She pleaded for a fraction of mercy, promising that the Harrington dynasty would publicly condemn Jared and support Apex Holdings in any future endeavors. She offered me the exact same hollow, worthless loyalty her father had offered just 24 hours earlier. I stopped and looked down at her tear-stained, desperate face. I remembered the exact way she had looked at my wife Josephine outside the Waldorf Astoria. She had stared at Josephine's simple, handmade dress with absolute, unfiltered disgust, dismissing a woman of profound substance simply because she lacked a designer label. Victoria had built her entire identity on judging those she deemed beneath her. Now she was groveling at my feet, begging a working-class father for financial salvation. I did not offer her a single syllable of comfort. I did not yell, and I did not gloat. I simply looked completely through her as if she were made of glass. I stepped past her trembling figure and walked directly into the waiting elevator. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing her out completely, I saw the exact moment her manufactured hope shattered into total despair. The heavy elevator doors sealed with a definitive click, leaving Victoria alone in the dim corridor. She turned back toward the main staging area, just as the federal agents began to march Jared toward the loading dock exits. My son twisted violently against the officer's iron grip, his panic escalating into pure terror. He locked eyes with Victoria and screamed her name, begging her to call her father's legal team. He pleaded with her to arrange bail to stand by him to remember their vows. He wept openly, his expensive suit tearing at the shoulder as he struggled. Victoria stood perfectly still, her face returning to a mask of absolute freezing apathy. She did not reach out. She did not offer a single word of reassurance. Instead, she reached into her dropped designer purse and retrieved her smartphone. Without breaking eye contact with her screaming husband, she unlocked the screen and dialed her elite divorce attorney. Jared watched in utter devastation as she calmly requested emergency asset protection and an immediate expedited filing for dissolution of marriage. The federal agents hauled him through the concrete archway, his desperate cries echoing off the walls before being swallowed by the sirens waiting outside. Victoria lowered her phone, breathing a heavy sigh of temporary relief. She believed she had successfully severed the dead weight of her marriage in time to salvage her own reputation. She turned toward the exit, calculating exactly how she would frame this narrative to her wealthy social circle. She planned to position herself as the brave survivor of a massive corporate con artist. But before she could take another step, her phone vibrated violently against her palm. A harsh red emergency alert flashed across the digital screen, displaying a priority message from the Harrington family estate manager. Victoria opened the notification, and her blood ran entirely cold. The message bluntly detailed a catastrophic medical emergency. Her father, the supposedly untouchable titan of luxury real estate, had been watching the live venture capital broadcast from his sprawling downtown office. Witnessing the highly public, televised obliteration of his entire financial empire and the immediate free fall of his corporate stock had proven too much for his fragile constitution. The sheer compounding terror of his sudden insolvency had triggered a massive stress-induced heart attack. The message ended with a terrifyingly brief sentence indicating he was currently unresponsive in the back of an ambulance fighting for his life. The fluorescent lights of the federal precinct interrogation room buzzed with a harsh, relentless frequency. The narrow space was constructed entirely of cinder block and cold steel, designed specifically to strip away the arrogant facades of white-collar criminals. Jared sat hunched over the bolted metal table, his hands trembling violently. The custom midnight blue suit that had cost $4,000 was now horribly wrinkled, the silk tie removed by booking officers as a standard self-harm precaution. He looked pathetic, a hollow shell of the charismatic visionary who had strutted onto a national television stage just hours ago. The heavy reinforced door unlatched with a loud metallic clank echoing down the bleak corridor. I stepped into the frigid room accompanied by my lead corporate counsel, Simon Pierce. I wore the same bespoke charcoal gray suit from the broadcast, my posture perfectly rigid, radiating the absolute authority of Apex Holdings. The exact second the heavy door locked behind us, Jared initiated his desperate theatrical performance. He threw his face into his hands and began to weep loudly. The sound echoed off the sterile walls, a pathetic symphony of manufactured grief. He lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and swimming with forced tears, and launched into a frantic monologue of calculated repentance. He completely dropped the sophisticated corporate vocabulary he had spent years perfecting, reverting instantly to the scared, vulnerable voice of a lost child. He begged me for forgiveness, swearing that he had been entirely manipulated by Victoria's family, claiming the crushing pressure of high society expectations had driven him to make catastrophic mistakes. He reached his shaking hands across the cold steel surface, pleading with me to post his federal bail. He promised that if I just paid his bond and hired an elite defense team, he would dedicate the rest of his life to making amends. He swore he would work the lowest entry-level job in my company, scrubbing floors if necessary, just to prove his renewed loyalty. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, banking his entire survival on the fundamental assumption that a father could never bear to see his own flesh and blood locked inside a concrete cage. He played the role of the broken, contrite son with masterful precision, pouring every ounce of his remaining energy into manipulating my paternal instincts. I stood silently opposite him, keeping my hands resting casually in my pockets. I watched the heavy tears stream down his pale cheeks and pool on the scratched metal table. I observed the frantic rise and fall of his chest, the trembling lower lip, the desperate, pleading gaze. I processed every single component of his emotional display with the cold, detached precision of a forensic auditor examining a forged signature. I felt absolutely no pity. I knew exactly what a genuine fracture of the soul looked like, and the display before me was nothing more than a desperate survival tactic. As he continued to sob, my mind transported me back to the freezing, rain-soaked night of our residential eviction. I remembered the precise sound the heavy deadbolt made when the bank agents directed by Jared's fraudulent mortgage default forced my front door open. I remembered standing on the wet pavement holding my wife's hand as our entire life was forcefully dismantled. Jared had been standing on our porch that night overseeing the asset seizure with a clipboard in his hand. He had not shed a single tear then. When the movers hesitated at the sight of Josephine's antique cedar chest holding generations of her family's heirlooms, Jared had impatiently stepped forward. He had grabbed the heavy wooden box himself and coldly tossed it down the concrete steps. The antique wood had shattered violently across the wet lawn, spilling my wife's irreplaceable memories directly into the mud. Jared had simply checked a box on his clipboard, completely devoid of empathy, entirely focused on liquidating his parents to satisfy his wealthy in-laws. The memory crystallized the absolute truth of the man sitting before me. The tears pooling on the interrogation table were entirely fake. The panic, however, was incredibly real. Jared was not crying because he felt remorse for the devastating pain he had inflicted upon his family. He was hyperventilating because the insulated, luxurious fortress he had constructed out of lies had finally collapsed, and he was absolutely terrified of the impending consequences. He was weeping for himself. He had operated with the ruthless, sociopathic detachment of a parasite for years, viewing everyone around him as disposable stepping stones. To bail him out now would not be an act of fatherly love. It would be a fatal enabling of a monster. I refused to let him claim another victim. I stepped forward and placed a single crisp legal document directly onto the center of the steel table, cutting off his frantic sobbing instantly. It was not a bail receipt or a retainer agreement for a criminal defense attorney. It was a court-mandated permanent restraining order formally severing all permitted contact between Jared and both Josephine and myself. I looked down into his stunned, tear-streaked face and delivered my final judgment with brutal mechanical clarity. I informed him that Apex Holdings would not authorize a single cent toward his federal bail bond. I explicitly stated that I would not leverage my corporate resources to hire a defense team to mitigate his federal fraud charges. He was entirely cut off from the foundational wealth he had spent his life trying to steal. The financial pipeline was permanently welded shut. I told him that he had chosen to build his empire on a bed of lies, and now he would have to face the federal prosecutors using only the resources he had genuinely earned, which amounted to absolutely nothing. He stared blindly at the restraining order, the terrifying realization dawning that his absolute last manipulation tactic had spectacularly failed. Before Jared could even attempt to formulate another desperate plea, Simon Pierce stepped up to the edge of the metal table, opening his black leather portfolio. Simon looked at my son with supreme professional disdain and delivered the absolute final blow. He coldly informed Jared that the federal asset seizure protocols had officially gone live 15 minutes ago. While Jared was sitting in this concrete cell crying for a bailout, government agents were actively repossessing his entire fraudulent lifestyle. Simon listed the ongoing operations with ruthless efficiency. Federal tow trucks were currently removing the fleet of leased luxury cars from his penthouse garage. The Securities and Exchange Commission had completely frozen and drained his personal and offshore bank accounts. Furthermore, because Victoria had directly benefited from the fraudulent funds, agents were systematically moving through her temporary hotel suite, seizing every single designer handbag, diamond watch, piece of high-end jewelry, and luxury garment purchased with stolen money. Jared was completely paralyzed. His entire world, his carefully curated identity, and his elite marriage were being physically dismantled and boxed up into federal evidence lockers, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the concrete walls closing in around him. The sprawling, meticulously manicured driveway of the leased Silicon Valley estate was completely choked by the heavy grinding machinery of federal repossession. Victoria Harrington stood entirely frozen on the pristine aggregate, her designer heels sinking slightly into the damp earth bordering the lawn. She was forced to watch in agonizing silence as a fleet of heavy-duty diesel tow trucks ruthlessly dragged her curated reality away piece by piece. The amber warning lights of the federal vehicles flashed aggressively against the white columns of the mansion, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare over the systematic dismantling of her life. Agents in dark windbreakers moved in a highly coordinated swarm through the massive double doors, carrying out sealed cardboard boxes packed with stolen luxury. Her custom diamond jewelry, the imported silk garments, and the pristine modern artwork she had purchased with my completely drained retirement funds were all cataloged, tagged, and unceremoniously dumped into the back of armored transport vans. The sheer physical loss of her assets was devastating, but the highly public humiliation was the true execution. The estate was located in one of the most exclusive, fiercely guarded, gated communities in the state. Now the heavy iron security gates were pinned wide open by absolute federal mandate. The high society friends and elite socialites she had spent years desperately trying to impress were currently driving past the wreckage of her life. Sleek silver Mercedes sedans and tinted black Range Rovers rolled by at an agonizingly slow pace. The tinted windows lowered just enough for the passengers to feast their eyes on the spectacular, unprecedented destruction of the Harrington princess. Victoria locked eyes with a woman she had hosted for a lavish charity gala just 3 days prior. The woman did not offer a look of sympathy or stop to offer assistance. She simply offered a cold, satisfied smirk before rolling up her window and accelerating away. The elite circle had instantly and unanimously banished her. Her platinum credit cards had been systematically declined all morning. Her private banking accounts were locked tightly under a federal freeze. She was entirely and undeniably bankrupt, completely stripped of the financial armor that had shielded her from the real world her entire life. Desperation finally overpowered her shock. Victoria marched violently across the driveway, stepping directly into the path of a burly, bearded repossession supervisor who was aggressively checking off items on a metal clipboard. She demanded he halt the operation immediately. She raised her chin, adopting the haughty, untouchable posture she had weaponized since childhood, and loudly invoked her family legacy. She demanded to know if he understood exactly who her father was explicitly threatening to deploy the Harrington legal team to crush his entire career. The supervisor did not flinch. He slowly lowered his clipboard and let out a harsh, genuinely amused laugh. He looked at the trembling heiress and informed her that her family name was the exact reason his crew had been authorized for an expedited no-knock seizure. He pulled a heavy, rugged tablet from his utility belt and tapped the screen displaying the morning's top financial news headlines. The Harrington real estate empire was not a shield, it was a highly toxic, radioactive punchline. The articles detailed how her father's legacy was constructed on the exact same predatory lending schemes and heavily inflated corporate valuations that Jared had so poorly attempted to mimic. For her entire life, Victoria had wielded her surname as a blunt instrument of terror. She had used the Harrington title to ruthlessly manipulate corporate boardrooms to threaten terrified service workers, and to confidently banish her husband's working-class parents from a wedding because their worn hands did not match her elite aesthetic. She had operated under the absolute delusion that her bloodline granted her total immunity from the harsh consequences governing ordinary people. The supervisor stepped past her, dismissing her completely. He stated that the Harrington dynasty was officially dead buried under a mountain of federal indictments and catastrophic national disgrace. The name she had proudly worn as a golden crown was now the very anchor dragging her down into the abyss. Miles away, deep within the sterile bowels of the federal holding facility, Jared secured his temporary release through an act of sheer, suicidal desperation. Stripped of all legitimate corporate backing and abandoned by his high-priced legal team, he had brokered a massive high-interest bail loan through a highly dangerous shadow lender he had previously used to quietly float his offshore debts. He traded his physical safety for temporary freedom, stepping out of the precinct into the biting chill of the late afternoon. He managed to secure a ride back to the leased estate, arriving exactly as the final federal transport van pulled out of the gates. He stumbled onto the empty driveway just in time to witness Victoria violently shoving a single overstuffed duffel bag into the trunk of a battered yellow city taxi. The stark contrast between the filthy cab and the fleet of private chauffeurs she usually commanded was a glaring testament to their ruin. Jared called out her name, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic hope. Victoria paused with her hand on the taxi door. She looked at him with a gaze of pure, concentrated venom. She smoothly slid the massive custom-cut diamond wedding ring off her finger. She did not hand it back to him. She hurled the heavy ring directly onto the rough asphalt. It bounced with a sharp metallic clatter, rolling discarded into the muddy street gutter. She slid into the cheap cab and slammed the door, leaving him absolutely isolated in the wreckage of his own making. Jared stood entirely alone on the expansive empty driveway. The massive oak doors of the mansion were locked tight, plastered with bright neon federal seizure notices prohibiting entry. He patted his pockets, finding absolutely nothing. His mobile phone, his expensive watches, and his wallet had been permanently confiscated as federal evidence. He was completely homeless and entirely devoid of financial resources. Worse still, the shadow lender who had posted his exorbitant bail now owned his physical existence, and the collection tactics of the underworld did not involve court orders or polite legal notices. He was actively hunted by aggressive, violent men seeking immediate returns on a toxic investment. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the valley, and the dark clouds finally broke, unleashing a heavy, freezing downpour. The cold rain soaked instantly through his wrinkled, ruined designer suit, chilling him straight to the bone. Stripped of his stolen crown, his elite wife, and his fabricated genius, he possessed absolutely zero options for survival in the world he had tried to conquer. He had only one single place left to go. Jared turned his back on the sealed mansion and began to walk. He started the agonizing 10-mile trek through the freezing rain, heading directly toward the old red brick house he had once tried to destroy. The agonizing 10-mile march through the freezing deluge stripped away the absolute last remnants of Jared's synthetic corporate armor. His $4,000 Italian leather Oxfords, designed exclusively for carpeted boardrooms and marble lobbies, offered zero protection against the flooded asphalt. Severe blisters ruptured and bled against the raw fabric of his soaked socks. His bespoke suit clung to his shivering frame like a freezing, suffocating second skin. He walked through the bleak gray dawn with a singular, desperate objective burning in his fractured mind. He would reach the old red brick house, break the small basement window near the garden hose, and hide in the damp darkness. He simply needed a physical sanctuary to sleep, to hide from the federal authorities, the aggressive reporters, and the violent shadow lenders currently hunting him. He rounded the final street corner of the familiar suburban neighborhood, expecting to see the sturdy, working-class home that had sheltered his entire youth. Instead, a deafening mechanical roar violently shattered the quiet morning air. A massive, heavy-duty yellow bulldozer sat idling on the muddy front lawn, its thick diesel exhaust billowing into the freezing rain. Jared froze, his exhausted mind struggling to process the chaotic scene. The towering machine revved its massive engine, lurching forward on thick steel tracks. The heavy hydraulic arm raised a jagged metal bucket high into the air before bringing it crashing down with catastrophic force directly into the front facade of the red brick house. The impact sounded like a bomb detonating. Decades-old bricks, white mortar, and shattered window glass exploded outward in a violent cloud of gray dust. Jared watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the steel bucket ripped through the second story, tearing away the exterior wall of his own childhood bedroom. Smashed drywall, splintered timber, and twisted copper wiring poured out of the gaping wound in the structure. The pristine sanctuary he had desperately marched 10 miles to claim was being systematically, brutally pulverized into an unrecognizable pile of industrial rubble. Directly across the street, standing completely safe behind a temporary chain-link perimeter fence, was Garrison. He wore a heavy yellow canvas raincoat and a white industrial hard hat, his posture perfectly straight and completely unaffected by the freezing downpour. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his lead corporate counsel, Simon Pierce, holding a steaming thermos of black coffee. He watched the violent destruction of his own home with the calm, calculating eyes of a veteran architect evaluating a cleared construction site. Jared stumbled across the muddy street, his legs threatening to collapse completely. He gripped the wet, freezing metal of the chain-link fence, coughing violently as the thick plaster dust washed over him. Garrison did not flinch at the sight of his ruined, shivering son. He did not offer a jacket or a single word of paternal comfort. He simply turned his head slightly toward Simon, speaking with a cold, resonant clarity that easily cut through the grinding roar of the diesel engine. He explained the fundamental reality of structural integrity. He stated that he had laid those red bricks by hand nearly 40 years ago, mixing the mortar in a rusted wheelbarrow during freezing weekends to ensure his family had an ironclad fortress. But a structure is only as strong as its foundation, and Jared had entirely poisoned the ground beneath it. By secretly placing a fraudulent secondary mortgage on the property and forging signatures to steal the equity, Jared had infected the house with an incurable malignant rot. Garrison explained that you cannot simply paint over a compromised foundation. You cannot sanitize a crime scene born of absolute parasitic betrayal. When a structure is fatally infected, a true builder understands that it requires a total, uncompromising purge. The demolition was not an act of blind anger. It was a surgical, necessary amputation to prevent the rot of his son's greed from spreading any further. Jared pressed his bleeding face against the cold metal links, screaming hysterically over the sound of snapping timber. He begged his father to stop the machinery, crying out that it was their home, their legacy, and his absolute last place of refuge on earth. He sobbed wildly, promising to pay back every single stolen cent if Garrison would just halt the bulldozer and let him hide inside the remaining walls. Garrison stepped directly up to the fence, looking into his son's bloodshot, desperate eyes. He raised a gloved hand and signaled the bulldozer operator to continue the demolition. The heavy steel bucket smashed through the roof, collapsing the entire living room ceiling in a deafening crash. Garrison informed Jared with brutal finality that the property no longer belonged to the Apex Holdings portfolio or the Harrington estate. He had legally signed the deed over to the city municipality at midnight. The fraudulent mortgage had been paid off, the toxic asset neutralized, and the poisoned ground entirely cleared. The city would break ground next month to construct a fully funded free pediatric medical clinic for low-income families. The land had been permanently repurposed for actual measurable good, replacing a monument to greed with a foundation of genuine healing. Jared had absolutely no legal claim, no physical shelter, and no remaining ties to the man standing in front of him. Jared slumped heavily against the wet chain-link fence, slipping down until his bleeding knees hit the muddy pavement. The total realization of his absolute isolation finally crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. Before he could even attempt to stand back up, the distinctive heavy crunch of wide tires rolling over wet gravel echoed directly behind him. A massive matte black SUV pulled to a silent, predatory stop right at the curb, entirely blocking his path of retreat. The 4 heavy doors opened simultaneously. 4 massive, heavily tattooed men wearing dark leather jackets stepped out into the freezing morning mist. They did not carry federal badges or official arrest warrants. They moved with the silent, lethal coordination of men who collected debts using blunt force trauma. The shadow lender who had financed Jared's exorbitant, desperate bail had arrived to immediately secure his highly toxic investment. The lead collector cracked his thick knuckles, stepping directly over a puddle to loom over Jared's trembling figure. They demanded their money, offering no extensions and no corporate negotiations. Jared looked up into their cold, violent eyes, the absolute horror setting in as he realized he had absolutely zero leverage, zero protection, and absolutely nothing left to give them. Jared collapses into the freezing mud, his bleeding knees sinking deep into the ruined earth of our former front lawn. He grips the cold, wet metal of the chain-link fence so tightly that the skin stretches taut across his white knuckles. The harsh, rhythmic idling of the shadow lender's matte black SUV behind him sounds exactly like the ticking of a terrifying execution clock. He presses his bruised face against the wire mesh, the freezing rain mixing with the thick, panicked tears streaming down his pale cheeks. He looks directly at me, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate shriek that cuts through the grinding roar of the idling bulldozer. He begs me to save his life. He screams that he will do absolutely anything I ask, promising to abandon the fraudulent corporate world forever and work in the freezing dirt right alongside me. He violently gestures to his ruined $4,000 Italian suit, claiming he will strip away the facade, vowing to lay bricks, pour concrete, and manually rebuild the very foundation he just spent the last 3 years trying to destroy. He promises to finally be the good, loyal, obedient son I had always wanted him to be. He throws frantic, terrified glances over his shoulder at the 4 massive tattooed men slowly advancing across the flooded pavement. The men do not rush. They move with the terrifying, inevitable pacing of professional collectors who know their target has absolutely nowhere left to run. Jared snaps his head back to me, his pleas devolving into incoherent, hyperventilating sobs. He points a shaking finger at the advancing men, screaming that they are going to kill him, that they will tear him apart if I do not immediately pay his bail loan. He begs me to open the heavy security gate to let him hide behind the towering yellow machinery, to write a single life-saving check from the Apex Holdings corporate account to clear his fatal ledger. He frantically insists that he has learned his lesson, that the brutal public humiliation and the sudden ruthless loss of his wife have completely cured his arrogance. He swears on his own life that he will never lie, steal, or manipulate anyone ever again. He is a cornered animal, entirely stripped of his expensive designer facade, violently bargaining for his basic physical survival as the men close the distance. I look down at the pathetic, shivering man groveling in the mud, feeling the immense, agonizing weight of paternal love violently colliding with the absolute necessity of harsh, uncompromising justice. Every instinct ingrained deeply in my chest over the last 35 years screams at me to unlock the gate step between my son and the approaching predators and absorb the brutal consequences of his actions. I vividly remember standing in the principal's office when Jared was just 12 years old, silently handing over my hard-earned overtime pay to cover the staggering cost of the school computers he had maliciously destroyed in a fit of manufactured rage. I remember working double shifts in the freezing winter wind to secretly pay off his wrecked first car, ensuring his insurance premiums would not ruin his financial record before he even reached college. I had spent my entire adult life acting as an indestructible human shield, constantly absorbing the massive impacts of his reckless, selfish arrogance. I had genuinely believed that my endless physical and financial sacrifices would eventually teach him the fundamental value of gratitude. Instead, shielding him from the fire had only taught him exactly how to strike the matches without burning his own fingers. I realized with crystal clarity that writing a massive check to the violent men standing behind him would not save my son. It would merely reload the weapon. Bailing him out of this lethal shadow debt would only reinforce the exact same parasitic delusion that had driven him to steal his father's home and rob a retired man's pension. If I open that gate today, he will simply return tomorrow with an exponentially larger debt, a darker corporate lie, and a significantly more destructive scheme. True love is not perpetually funding a toxic illusion. Sometimes, the most profound act of fatherly devotion is stepping entirely out of the way and letting the sheer crushing force of gravity take its natural devastating course. I look at his pleading eyes and recognize that the innocent boy I raised is officially dead, buried completely beneath thick layers of synthetic corporate greed and calculated betrayals. The man clinging to the fence is a manufactured fraud who only values me for the immediate liquidity in my bank accounts. Saving him now would not be an act of mercy. It would be a fatal betrayal of the very principles of honesty, accountability, and hard work I had spent my entire life trying to build. I maintain absolute unflinching eye contact with Jared as his frantic screaming begins to echo off the heavy steel tracks of the bulldozer. I do not reach for my checkbook, and I do not signal the security personnel to open the perimeter gates. Instead, I slowly reach inside the interior breast pocket of my charcoal gray suit jacket. I withdraw a single sharply folded piece of paper, completely ignoring the freezing rain that immediately begins to stain the black ink. I step forward and slip the paper precisely through the narrow gaps of the chain-link fence, letting it fall directly into the thick mud at his bleeding knees. Jared frantically scrambles to snatch the paper, his eyes widening in desperate manic hope, completely expecting a certified bank draft or a corporate guarantee of payment from Apex Holdings. He unfolds the damp paper with violently shaking hands. It is the original itemized receipt for the cheap tuxedo rental from the morning of his wedding day. I look at him with cold, surgical finality. I state clearly that my ledger is entirely balanced and my parental obligations are officially fulfilled. I tell him that his debts are now entirely his own. I do not wait to watch the crushing realization snap the last remaining fragments of his shattered mind. I simply turn my back on the fence and walk away with steady, measured strides. I pull open the heavy reinforced door of my waiting armored vehicle and slide into the secure, heated interior. As the driver puts the vehicle into gear and begins to pull smoothly away from the muddy curb, I look into the side mirror for one final fleeting second. The four heavily tattooed men reach the chain-link fence. The lead collector violently grabs Jared by the collar of his ruined, soaked Italian suit, effortlessly lifting him completely out of the freezing mud. Jared screams a final ragged plea into the pouring rain, his legs kicking weakly against the empty air. The men drag him backward across the rough, flooded asphalt, hauling him directly toward the open doors of the matte black SUV. The dark vehicle swallows him whole, the heavy doors slamming shut with a muffled, echoing thud. The SUV accelerates aggressively down the wet street, disappearing entirely into the gray morning mist. The past is officially, irrevocably severed. Exactly 365 days had passed since the freezing morning rain washed away the final remnants of a toxic delusion. The brutal, deafening noise of the previous year had finally dissolved into an absolute, untouchable tranquility. I sat quietly beside my wife Josephine on the expansive wraparound balcony of our primary penthouse suite. We rested in custom-upholstered chairs elevated 50 stories above the sprawling metropolitan grid. The crisp, clean air of the early morning brushed against my face, carrying none of the bitter exhaust or concrete dust that had defined the demolition of our past. I watched the golden edge of the rising sun slowly ignite the glass skyscrapers painting the city below in brilliant shades of amber and pale blue. The legal trials, the exhaustive federal depositions, and the endless media circuses were definitively over. The aggressive reporters who had camped outside our corporate headquarters had moved on to the next fleeting scandal. The frantic courtroom shouting had been permanently silenced by the cold, heavy slam of judicial gavels. For decades, I had operated with the hyper-vigilant defensive posture of a frontline soldier, perpetually bracing for the next catastrophic impact of my son's reckless arrogance. I had lived in a state of constant suffocating tension, waiting for the phone to ring, with demands for immediate bail money or desperate pleas to cover stolen funds. Now looking out over the waking city, that heavy armor was entirely gone. The phantom weight I had carried in my chest since Jared first learned to lie had been surgically removed. Josephine reached across the small glass table and placed her warm, steady hand gently over mine. Her touch grounded me in the present moment, offering a silent, profound validation of the grueling path we had walked together. We did not need to speak about the courtroom victories or the obliterated corporate rivals to validate our survival. The profound stillness enveloping the balcony was the ultimate proof of our triumph. We had survived the ultimate betrayal, standing firm against a calculated attempt to destroy our minds, our legacy, and our very home. We had drawn an absolute boundary, and in doing so, we had reclaimed our lives. The morning light slowly warmed the cold steel railing of the terrace, banishing the last lingering shadows of a dark, exhausted history. Down in the working-class neighborhood where our old red brick house once stood, a pristine, state-of-the-art facility now occupied the newly purified ground. The city municipality had utilized my unconditional land donation exactly as promised. The neighborhood children were currently receiving world-class medical care inside the newly opened pediatric clinic. The structure featured bright, welcoming architecture and wide glass windows, standing as a permanent, enduring monument to genuine healing rather than synthetic greed. I had personally overseen the pouring of the clinic's concrete foundation, ensuring the earth was completely cured of the parasitic rot that had briefly infected it. Meanwhile, the towering, fraudulent empire of the Harrington family had been violently dismantled and sold for scrap. Victoria's father had survived his massive stress-induced heart attack only to wake up in a sterile hospital bed to the brutal reality of total insolvency. Federal auditors had aggressively seized his assets, exposing decades of predatory lending practices. His luxury real estate firm was systematically liquidated, and the remaining profitable fragments were quietly absorbed by Apex Holdings subsidiaries for mere pennies on the dollar. Victoria herself was stripped of every designer label and stolen luxury she possessed. Completely banished from the elite social circles she had ruled through intimidation, she was forced to move into a modest, cramped apartment in a forgotten suburb. She currently worked a grueling entry-level retail job, finally learning the harsh, unglamorous reality of earning an honest wage without the protective shield of a stolen trust fund. As for Jared, his desperate escape with the shadow lenders had been remarkably brief. Federal agents who had been actively tracking the violent collection ring intercepted the black SUV less than a mile from my demolished property. The resulting tactical raid captured the lenders and delivered Jared directly into federal custody. Cornered by irrefutable digital evidence and abandoned by everyone he had ever manipulated, Jared ultimately pleaded guilty to a massive sequence of federal wire fraud, corporate espionage, and severe embezzlement charges. The presiding judge showed absolutely zero leniency toward his manufactured tears. Jared was promptly handed a strict mandatory 5-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He traded his custom Italian silk suits for a coarse, oversized orange jumpsuit. He was entirely locked away from the glamorous world he had so desperately sought to conquer, surrounded by cold cinder block and unforgiving iron bars. The soft chime of this private elevator interrupted the morning silence. Simon Pierce stepped onto the penthouse terrace holding a single, exceptionally thin leather folder. It was a striking visual departure from the massive, heavy binders of damning evidence he had carried throughout the litigation process. Simon placed the folder onto the glass table and stepped back with a respectful nod. I picked up my gold fountain pen and opened the document. I moved my hand across the signature lines with absolute, unwavering conviction. With those swift strokes, I officially stepped down from my position as chairman of Apex Holdings. I executed the irrevocable transfer of my entire remaining liquid fortune into a permanent, highly regulated, blind trust. The legal mandate of the trust was crystal clear and completely unbreakable. The massive wealth would be exclusively utilized to fund and construct advanced vocational trade schools for disadvantaged youth in our old district. The programs would teach young men and women the enduring, honorable skills of laying brick, pouring concrete, and building genuine, indestructible foundations. Simon collected the signed paperwork, shook my hand firmly, and quietly descended back into the city below. Before departing, Simon had placed one final item on the table. It was a standard cheap paper envelope bearing the sterile ink-stamped seal of a high-security federal penitentiary. The frantic, slanted handwriting across the front was unmistakably Jared's. I slowly picked up the letter, holding it up against the bright morning light. I rubbed my thumb across the rough institutional paper, searching my chest for even a microscopic trace of lingering sorrow, anger, or paternal obligation. I found absolutely nothing but empty, unbothered air. I did not break the seal. I did not open the envelope to read his desperate apologies, his manufactured promises of rehabilitation, or his inevitable demands for an early release appeal. I simply stood up and walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting in the corner of the home office. I fed the unopened envelope directly into the humming steel blades, watching the last physical manifestation of my past turn into unrecognizable confetti. I walked back to the kitchen, poured 2 fresh cups of dark roast coffee, and returned to the balcony. I handed a warm mug to Josephine. We stood shoulder to shoulder watching the city wake up. True peace is found in the silence left behind. True power is absolutely never found in stolen wealth or a fabricated family legacy. A foundation built on deceit, manipulation, and arrogance will inevitably crumble when tested by reality. When you treat people as disposable assets and use your status to humiliate others, you guarantee your own absolute isolation when the fortress falls. Genuine respect is earned through honesty, integrity, and hard work, not purchased with fraudulent funds. You cannot escape the severe consequences of your actions forever. Ultimately, the toxic empire you desperately construct to escape your roots becomes the exact prison that ensures your complete and total destruction.